Chapter 7. Into the Forest. Haldrissa expected no word yet from Darnassus, but that did not mean that she remained idle in the meantime. She did not trust that the orcs were not already on the move. Thus it was that the very next day she had led another party out to investigate an area near the foothills east of the Night Elven Camp Maester's Post. With her was Xanon, chosen for his sharp eyes. Danae had been left in command back at the fort, not something Haldrissa's second had been happy about. As senior-most officer, it would behoove you to remain behind, Danae had even suggested in her most courteous manner, just in case of trouble in the wilderness. Her point had had merit, but at the time Haldrissa had not been able to get past the thought that perhaps Danae had believed herself more capable of facing the rigors of the journey and any encounters during it. Haldrissa had declined the officer's suggestion without hesitation. However, now, some time into the ride, the twinges Haldrissa felt made her occasionally wonder if she should have listened more. But all thought of that vanished as Xanon returned with 2 other sentinels from scouting the territory up ahead. Haldrissa had purposely chosen an obscure area less likely to be of interest to the Horde for the very reason that the enemy might have played on that reasoning. The commander had survived so long by learning to try to think like the enemy, however repulsive that might be to her at times. She had to do her best to expect the unexpected. Of course, both Danae and Xanon had looked dubious when first informed where she intended to lead the party. However, Xanon did not look so dubious now. In fact, his concerned expression made everyone who had been waiting, especially Haldrissa, sit straight and taut. "What is it?" she asked the moment he was near. "Best see," he gasped, still exerted from the swift ride back. "This way." One brow raised at this curious reply, the commander waved the party to follow Xanon. The trained nightsabers leapt effortlessly and silently through the forest, dodging around trees and across uneven terrain with an agility that Haldrissa still admired after all these millennia. Each cat was in the prime of its life. For the first time the commander considered her previous mounts and the ends of their turbulent lives. While some nightsabers did perish in battle, more than a few had survived their last years crippled from previous injuries. It brought home again her own encroaching mortality. The night elves kept a wary eye out, though thus far there was no indication as to what Xanon and the other pair had sighted. The male sentinel hunched low as he rode, a sign of just how determined he was to get his commander to wherever they needed to be as quickly as possible. That boded ill in her mind. Then deep into a dense part of the forest, amidst a small patch of winding hills, Xanon abruptly signaled for the party to slow to a trot. Haldrissa urged her mount alongside his, then leaned close. "What?" "Listen." She knew his ears were sharper than most, too, but even taking that into account, the commander marveled that he heard anything. Even the nightsabers appeared not to notice anything out of the ordinary. "I do not," Haldrissa began, then paused. There was a very faint sound from far ahead. An odd, unsettling sound. It even had a strange rhythm to it. The same beat, over and over and over. "What is that?" one of the others murmured. "It sounds familiar." "I want to see more." Peering back at the party, she ordered, "The rest of you, keep back. Xanon and I will investigate from here on. If you are needed, we will try to signal." The rest of the sentinels did not look pleased, but they obeyed. Xanon urged his nightsaber on, but at a much slower, more precise pace. Haldrissa made her mount match speed. As they neared, Xanon readied his glaive. Haldrissa did the same. The buzzing now dominated. It was a harsh, painful noise, and was accompanied by a cracking sound. That sound, at least, the commander knew. It was the sound of wood breaking. She now had a fairly good idea of what was going on, though the specifics of it still eluded her. Ever seeking expansion, the Horde had a voracious appetite for wood. They needed it for building, for their forges, for their growing fleets. And that was why they most coveted Ashenvale.
It would be wiser to go on foot from here,
Xanon whispered. Nodding, Haldrissa dismounted, and then she and Xanon loosely tethered their cats. Highly intelligent, these Nightsabers would obey the command to stay until called by one of the riders. In an emergency, it better served Haldrissa if the animals could quickly come to their aid. Xanon once more took the lead, the younger night elf crouching low. The wind shifted toward them. While good in that it kept their scent from the orcs, it also brought a stench that answered some of Haldrissa's other questions. The smell included a combination of fuel and steam. Those were signs of a goblin machine. Several machines, judging by the potent and often suffocating odor. Goblins were almost the antithesis of night elves. They believed in the might of machines over nature, and had little, if any, respect for the latter. "There," Xanon rasped, thrusting a finger to the northeast. At first Haldrissa thought some armored giant stalked the forest, a giant intent on carnage. What in some ways resembled a glaive with far, far sharper, curved points spun madly at the end of one arm. The other arm ended in a monstrous claw with 4 digits that at that moment seized the trunk of a thick oak. The giant then thrust the spinning blades at the tree. To her horror, the blades cut into the wood as if it were water. Within seconds the mighty oak teetered, its life already gone. But the giant figure was not satisfied with just that. It shifted position and began slicing the tree into smaller pieces. Only then did Haldrissa see that atop the head there was a seat, and that in that seat a short figure with green skin, long ears, and a sadistic smile manipulated levers. "A shredder," she murmured back to Xanon. "A goblin shredder." There had been reports of the machines being brought in farther east, but to find one this close was disturbing. "Wait," Xanon whispered. "Keep listening." Before she could ask why, the buzzing arose from another location. As the two looked, a second shredder trundled into view. The silver and crimson mechanism paused. The upper half turned to one side, as no true creature could without breaking its spine. In the seat, and half shielded by the armored front, another goblin surveyed the nearest trees. Choosing one, he tugged on a lever, and the spinning blades began their diabolical work. Haldrissa silently swore at such sacrilege. She started to rise, only to have sense make her duck down just as a third and fourth shredder stepped into sight. "They have a major lumber operation in progress here," the male night elf told her. "I counted 2 more before. They are ripping apart this area of Ashenvale as if the trees had no feelings, no importance." 6 shredders. Haldrissa did some calculations. "We can handle that many." And then the scene became an even more horrible nightmare. Another shredder joined the others, followed by another and another and another. More than a score quickly filled their view, and yet the numbers continued to grow. "Pyaloon," gasped Xanon. "This is worse than I imagined." "We must leave," returned Haldrissa, beginning to back away. The 2 sentinels, their eyes ever on the horror, retreated, heading for the area where they had left their mounts. The wind shifted direction again. A thick smell of fuel and steam assailed Haldrissa from their left. "Beware!" she cried, shoving Xanon away from that direction. The shredder came crashing through the trees and brush, the metallic claws ripping away branches that blocked the path. High-pitched maniacal laughter cut above the sound of spinning blades. With a death's head grin, the goblin adjusted the levers. The blades came at Haldrissa. She was forced to dodge toward her blind side and thus stumbled. The blades just barely grazed her shoulder. However, despite that and the fact that Haldrissa wore plate armor, the shredder was still able to cut through the metal and rip a tiny but painful gash in her flesh. The wound, though shallow, startled the commander enough that she again made for a tempting target. The upper half of the shredder turned toward her. Another wild laugh escaped the goblin as he maneuvered the whirring blades. The sentinel's only good fortune thus far lay in that this goblin had moved far ahead of the rest, and because of the din created by the destruction of the forest, their struggle went unheard. Haldrissa could not hope for that to continue, though. At the very least, she and Xanon had to escape. A whirling glaive flew by her. It came within a yard of the goblin before the other arm deflected it. Xanon's weapon went skimming wildly through the air, at last sinking deep into a nearby trunk. The attack had at least served to give Haldrissa breathing space. In that time she jumped out of reach, then readied her own glaive. The goblin shifted levers. The shredder marched toward her. The one arm continued to act as shield while the other, with the spinning toothy blades, stretched forth. Haldrissa took the measure of the shredder, then, compensating for her impaired vision, threw. Her toss looked as if it had gone wide at first, but as it passed the grinning goblin, it arced around. The commander kept her expression frozen, afraid of giving warning. But she had underestimated both the goblin and his device. The squat creature tugged the lever, and the protecting arm twisted over his head in a manner that would have been impossible for a living creature. With a harsh clang, her glaive rebounded off of the arm and away from the struggle. Haldrissa swore. "Come here, Purple," the goblin mocked. "Let me give you a hug." The arms swung toward her from opposite directions, seeking to pen her between them so that the blades could do their work. Haldrissa dropped to the ground, barely avoiding being beheaded. She fully expected the goblin to immediately compensate, but instead the arms began flailing madly. As the commander pushed herself up, she saw Xanon scrambling up the side of the shredder. He did not have his glaive, but the dagger in his left hand was more than sufficient for dealing with the shredder's operator, if the male night elf could get a little closer. The goblin was having none of that. The flailing was accompanied by the swiveling of the torso, all in an attempt to knock Xanon free. While it had not succeeded in that respect, it did keep the sentinel from using his blade. Aware that trying to signal the others now might also alert all the goblins and whatever other elements of the horde were nearby of the Alliance presence, Haldrissa tried to think of some way to quickly put an end to their lone foe. She peered around. Her own glaive was too far away, but Xanon's remained stuck in the nearby tree. She darted for the weapon, hoping that her companion could keep the goblin distracted long enough, and without dying in the process. But though she reached the glaive without difficulty, pulling it free proved a much more troublesome task. The glaive had buried itself deep, and even though Haldrissa tugged as hard as she could, all the while gritting her teeth as her effort made her wound sting much greater, it would not come free. Buzzing filled her ears. She glanced in the direction of the other shredders, but they were not even in sight, and therefore not the source of the increased buzzing. Haldrissa ducked. The blades of the lone shredder tore into the tree. Splinters and sawdust rained down upon the night elf. A screeching sound tore at her eardrums. As she rolled aside, she saw that the shredder's blades had met the glaive. The resultant collision had made both the shredder and the tree shake violently. Swearing, the goblin adjusted several levers. The other arm came up and braced against the trunk. With amazing strength, the shredder used the leverage to push free. Haldrissa saw no sign of Xanon, and had to assume the worst. With his glaive ruined, she surveyed the area for her own. The damaged tree creaked ominously. Haldrissa stepped back, but saw that the danger was not as imminent as she had thought. The tree shook slightly, then stilled. The goblin adjusted the levers, then moved in on her again. As he did, Haldrissa finally caught a glimpse of Xanon. He lay sprawled next to another tree. She could not see any sign of injury, but the stillness of the body did not give her much hope. However, seeing Xanon stirred a desperate plan. The commander hoped that she judged the damage to the tree correctly, or else she was about to throw herself into the jaws of death. "Xanon!" she roared. "To his left!" The goblin reacted accordingly. Straining at the levers, he made the torso spin around to confront the threat he believed there. Had Haldrissa attempted to leap up at him, he would have had more than enough time to notice her and prevent success. Instead, the night elf ran behind the damaged tree. The goblin saw that the male sentinel still lay unconscious or was dead. He pulled a lever, and the shredder started to turn back to her. Bracing herself, Haldrissa threw her body against the back of the tree. The collision shook her to the bone, but she heard the wood give a satisfying snap. The tree toppled. Haldrissa made a silent prayer to Elune. She had judged both the damage and the angle true. The huge tree fell toward the shredder. The goblin looked up as the shadow covered him. He frantically adjusted the levers, raising both arms in an attempt to stop the tree. However, when it became clear that the arms would not stop the tree in time, the goblin pushed himself out of his seat. He did not make it. The tree reduced the shredder and its handler to a squat ruin. The tanks that fueled the mechanism ruptured. The shredder exploded, sending metal fragments and bits of goblin flying everywhere. Even before the tree had struck, Haldrissa had headed for Xanon. She did not want to leave her officer if there was even a chance he lived. "Xanon," the commander hissed. "Xanon!" He did not stir, but Haldrissa saw that the male sentinel did at least breathe. There was a heavy bruise on the side of his head, and blood stained his face and arm. With no other option, Haldrissa wrapped her arm around the other night elf's upper torso, and ignoring the pain in her arm, dragged him from the site. Peering over her shoulder, she caught a glimpse of one of the other shredders starting to move toward the ruined one. So low to the ground, Haldrissa believed that its operator could not yet see her or her burden, but she nonetheless hurried as best she could. If the pair was spotted, they would never escape. A glint caught her eye. Grimacing, Haldrissa set down Xanon long enough to retrieve her glaive. It meant the cost of a few valuable seconds, but without the glaive there would be absolutely no chance of defending the two of them. The sound of encroaching shredders increased. There were no cries of discovery, though. The commander counted on the hope that the goblins would focus on their own, thinking that perhaps the operator had miscalculated while trying to bring down the tree, rather than that he had been sadistically hunting down night elf prey. She only needed that false belief to last long enough for her to reach the cats. Dragging Xanon, Haldrissa finally paused at a spot several yards away and out of sight. She let out a low whistle. Her heart pounded as she waited. Finally her mount trotted into view. The night saber rubbed its muzzle against her side. The second cat joined them. It sniffed Xanon and let out a low growl. Haldrissa shushed it, then settled the unmoving officer over the creature's back. When that was done, she mounted her own animal. Behind her, a commotion arose as the goblins investigated what Haldrissa hoped still passed for an accident. Exhaling deeply, the commander urged the night sabers forward. She did not relax in the least until they were far away. Haldrissa counted the seconds until she reached the rest of the party, all of whom eyed her arrival with trepidation. "Take care of him," she ordered two of the others. As they took control of Xanon, Haldrissa faced the rest. "It is worse than we had imagined. More mechanized goblin shredders than I had thought could exist. They are already ripping apart the forest over here. We can assume that they are doing the same elsewhere, I am sorry to say." "We should charge in and take care of those little vermin," snarled one sentinel. "We should be able to handle such scum." Some of the others issued their agreement by raising their glaives, but Haldrissa immediately cut off any notion of an attack. There will be no suicidal attack. We ride back now. This information must be passed on to Darnassus.
And then we just wait?
Blurted one of the others.
Of course not.
Enough questions. To the two night elves handling Xanon, she commanded, Secure him well. We will have to ride hard. Haldrissa paused as she saw their faces.
He is dead,
the nearest sentinel informed her and the rest.
For some minutes, the wound to his head was too grave.
To emphasize her point, she tilted Xanon's head until the party could see the blackening bruise and increased blood flow, something to which Haldrissa, caught up in the escape, had not been able to pay attention. The commander scowled. Another death at the Horde's hand. Though her body ached, her pulse pounded.
They will pay.
They will pay for all the deaths, including those of the forest. Haldrissa urged her mount on, the others following in her wake. She glanced behind her. The body of Xanon, secured well, rode with them. The dead rider very likely a harbinger of things to come, she knew. Chapter 8. Arrivals. Although there would be an official entrance by the various members of the Alliance once the summit had commenced, arrangements had been made for the representatives' personal arrivals beforehand. The Night Elves had been willing to host everyone in the capital, but by majority vote from the others it was agreed that the emissaries and a small personal escort would stay in Darnassus, while the rest of their people remained aboard the various vessels. The full contingents would march in the procession opening the summit. Then, after the ceremony, they would return to the ships until the gathering's end. The High Priestess had finally seen the wisdom of the decision, though not for the reasons her guests had used. The more members of each nation staying in the capital during the delicate proceedings, the greater the chance of tempers flaring and incidents overtaking their goals. With each realm still reeling from the cataclysm, the risk of that happening was very high already. Theramore was the first member of the Alliance to reach Teldrassil. Tyrande and Malfurion met the key representative and his escort as they exited the portal into Darnassus.
Well met, Archmage Turvash, the High Priestess greeted.
The black-haired mage bowed his head to both.
In the name of Lady Jaina Proudmoore, ruler of the Isle of Theramore, I thank you for your hospitality during this most significant of functions. We are honored to have you here in her stead, though we hope that Lady Jaina is well.
Turvash smoothed his black and violet robes. As one of Jaina Proudmoore's aides, he also wore a somewhat elaborate gold vest with ornamented shoulders.
With the troubles brewing all around us, she chose to stay in order to continue organizing Alliance forces. You can trust that she would rather be here, High Priestess.
Her martial knowledge has been invaluable during these dark days, Malfurion put in.
In that, at least, she takes after her father.
Turvash said nothing more, the subject of Admiral Dalen Proudmoore a delicate one. His obsession with the orcs had led to his untimely death in battle against the half-breed Rexar during the storming of Theramore's keep. Rexar, in whose veins ogre blood also flowed, had not wanted the Admiral's death, but Dalen had given them no choice. Admiral Proudmoore's daughter still mourned him, even though his actions had forced her to side with the Horde over her own father. The High Priestess hesitated, then asked, "And how is Pained?" Turvash pursed his lips.
She performs her duties for Lady Jaina as stoically as ever. The great scar from her confrontation with dark magi is nothing compared to the scars left in her mind because of that event.
He shrugged.
But she will not accept any help. Her stubbornness has always been both a detriment and a saving grace. I will continue to pray for her healing, both without and within. Tyrande shook her head, then smiled once more. But on to more immediate matters. You will wish to refresh yourselves. She indicated one of her aides. Please show the Archmage and his escort to their quarters. Turvosh bowed again. I look forward to the summit. As the emissary from Theramore departed, the High Priestess murmured, And there goes probably the easiest of those with whom we shall deal. Would that all the others could see matters as straightforward as Theramore. They will see sense, Tyrande. They must. The Archmage had barely left them when news came that the dwarven emissaries had arrived on the island, from all 3 clans. This can hardly be coincidence, Tyrande declared, as she and her mate, joined now by several priestesses, waited before the portal. Could they have traveled together? The Bronzebeards and the Wildhammers had agreed to, due to Ruttheron's limited dock space, but I had not heard about the Dark Irons. Amazing to think that they managed to sail here with them aboard as well. If they did, I suspect that the clans stayed in separate parts of the ship throughout the entire journey, and very likely even disembarked separately. I would not have wanted to make that journey, the High Priestess returned with a shake of her head. They waited for the 3 emissaries to come through the portal, but time went on and still nothing happened. The Archdruid and Tyrande exchanged concerned glances. Perhaps I should go down. But Malfurion got no further before the portal flared, and the first of the dwarves entered the capital. Hail, Thargus and Vamar, Tyrande said, immediately recognizing the grizzled dwarf known as a hero among the Bronzebeards. Thargus had acted as representative during previous discussions between his people and Darnassus. Hail to ye, milady, the squat but muscular figure rumbled. Although he stood much shorter than either night elf, he was more than twice Malfurion's width, and all of that muscle. Forgive the delay. Bit of an argument over who went up first. The dwarven race was in flux, the tensions among the clans of much concern even to Tyrande and her mate. Other than Stormwind, the dwarves as a whole had been one of the most questionable of the possible attendees. The Night Elves were pleased that they had arrived, but if it only meant that the emissaries would come to blows, then all would be for naught. How was it settled? Not by axe, Tyrande hoped. Thargus chuckled. Wildhammer suggested we roll the bones. Best idea. We did that. And Bronzebeard won, of course. The High Priestess and Malfurion allowed themselves smiles. Trust dwarves to choose such a basic path to solve their problem. We are pleased to see you, the Archdruid added. Thank you for coming. You've been strong allies. Bronzebeard wouldn't have turned its back on that. Now the Dark Irons, maybe. Tyrande led the emissary and his band forward. You must be hungry after your travels. These 2 will guide you to your chambers and to the meal we've arranged for you. There be drink, too. Both Night Elven wine and Dwarven ale. Thargus's grin widened. With a nod, he led his group after the 2 priestesses. Tyrande relaxed a little once the dwarves were out of sight. Well done, my love, the Archdruid whispered. Best to get them moving, so as not to stir up troubles again, especially if the next ones through are... The portal flared, and a small band of dour, black-clad dwarves warily stepped through. They were of a pale, almost deathly complexion, and to the Archdruid were almost interchangeable save for the fact that some had dusky brown hair, others a dull black or faded red. Only the lead dwarf seemed to have any true individuality, and that from the cunning the Night Elf could read in the emissary's burning red eyes. Although their weapons were not drawn, the Dark Iron's hands hovered near them just in case.
However, upon seeing only Malfurion, Tyrande, and the priestesses waiting to help guide the guests, the group relaxed. Slightly. "Hail, emissary of the Dark Iron clan," Tyrande uttered, unfamiliar with any of the party, including the leader. "I am Druken. I speak for Moira Tharrison," the shadowy figure in the forefront rasped. His red eyes took stock of the two chief figures in front of him, clearly sizing up their potential as threats. "You are welcome, Druken, you and your escort. We have your quarters available, not to mention meal and drink." "We've brought our own." Druken indicated several heavy sacks and kegs of ale his companions carried. "We'll need nothing." "As you like. I will see that they are removed. If you change your mind, please let me know." Druken grunted. He and his cohort trailed after the two guides Tyrande provided. Once the Dark Iron dwarves had stepped out of earshot, Malfurion muttered, "Trusting souls. They came here. That says a lot. And from what little you have told me, they seem to be in about as much agreement with us as the Bronzebeards. The Dark Iron dwarves cannot afford to become isolated right now. They need to maintain ties with the Alliance in general, if not, perhaps, their fellow dwarves." The portal activated again. "Wildhammer greets its hosts," the short, rather stout figure in red and gold armor roared cheerfully from the forefront of the latest arrivals. The other dwarves behind him added their own boisterous rumbles of agreement, a few accenting their greetings with waves of their hammers. Tyrande stepped forward to greet the leader. "Welcome, Kurdrin. A pleasure to have you with us." The dwarf, his long thick beard and even more fiery red than his armor, smiled. "I thought I'd waited long enough before popping up. Those Dark Irons give any problem?" "Other than refusing our food and drink, they were very polite," the Archdruid answered. "Like as nae they're afraid of being poisoned by someone, as it's nae so uncommon among their ilk. Glad to hear everything went as I'd planned, then." "Planned?" The Wildhammer dwarf leaned close and in a conspiratorial tone explained, "None of us wanted the others to get to the island first, and no one wanted to be dead last. So we all agreed to arrive at the same time. Our honor on that sworn on the hammer." Kurdrin snorted. "No one mentioned this portal, though. Got to it, and arguing broke out about who had the right to go up ahead of the others. And that was when someone suggested gambling for it." "Well, I did not exactly say it that way, but yes, that's what I told them." The High Priestess's eyes narrowed knowingly. "You were the one who suggested it." "That's it, and worked out very well, I think." Tyrande pressed. "So it is sheer coincidence that the order happened as it did. You seem very cheerful for being third, and the Dark Irons being second is perhaps the safest situation there." Kurdrin cocked his head. If anything, his grin widened more. "Now would I be the type to go fixin' a game of bones?" "You must be weary after your long journey," she said, as if the question had not been asked. Tyrande, smiling back, gestured to two more priestesses. "They will take you to your quarters. Food and drink have been made ready." "I thank ye for all of us." The dwarf gave both his hosts hearty handshakes, then led his party off after the guides. The encounter with Kurdrin proved only a slight reprieve. As other representatives arrived, both Night Elves again became aware of just how much hung on the success of the gathering, and how much also hung on not only Varian Rin's arrival, but his agreement on the most important matters as well. There had still been no official word concerning the King of Storm Wind's coming, and while both trusted Chandras's report, they could not help but grow concerned. With the arrival of each other faction, the thought that perhaps something had happened grew stronger. When it seemed clear that no more ships would arrive for some time, the duo gratefully retired. There were no official audiences. Tyrande had wanted the emissaries to relax first, the better for their minds to be calm for the upcoming debates. No one spoke of his own realm's troubles, the Archdruid noted as they neared the temple. Perhaps that will not be a situation during the gathering. Do you really think so?
Well.
Malfurion shook his head. No, not really. Their conversation ended as both noticed a pair of conspicuous figures waiting outside the temple. Even from a distance, their brilliant garments marked them as highborn. Archmage Mordant, Tyrande greeted politely. The highborn leader was slightly thinner than his companion, and his face was more lined. Varden, to what do we owe this unexpected pleasure? Neither highborn gave any indication that there might have been some hint of sarcasm on her part. They knew the High Priestess well enough to know that she treated them respectfully. Varden here insisted that we come. I knew you had other pressing matters to attend to, but it seems the only way to assuage his concerns and those of the younger, more impatient ones. Is something amiss? The younger highborn cut in. The perfect question, save that instead of something, you might say someone. Mind your place, Mordant insisted to his protege. There can be 100 innocent reasons for Therebrin's absence. Malfurion took command of the conversation. One of yours is missing, Archmage. When was he last seen? He was one of those with me, Varden answered. No one noticed that he did not return until much later. Everyone was unaffected by the spell work. Of course. We knew what we were doing. The younger highborn looked very offended by any suggestion otherwise. Mordant shook his head in disappointment. Behave yourself. You will answer with the proper respect the Archdruid and High Priestess deserve. Varden grudgingly nodded. My apologies, Archdruid. Continue, please. Does anyone recall where they last saw him? Malfurion pressed. None remember him returning after the spell work. I asked all of them. The Archdruid considered what Varden had said, then turned to his mate. I had best deal with this now. I think so. Please be cautious. He smiled grimly. I will be. Varden led Malfurion back to the location of the spellcasting. The mage obviously still distrusted anyone who was not one of the highborn, but answered all of the Archdruid's questions. And no one recalls at all where he even stood. There was no need to. Malfurion could not fault that logic, though it seemed to him that if the highborn had as much concern for one another as they pretended, someone would at least have remembered something concerning the missing spellcaster's whereabouts. The Archdruid knelt down near the area where the circle had formed. He waved his hand over the grass and murmured to the blades. Have you seen? Malfurion asked of them. Have you seen? The grass was eager to speak with him, for no one generally asked any favor, but it could only state that some group of creatures had tread upon it. It was the answer that Malfurion had expected, but despite not having learned anything, he still thanked the grass. I cast spells over the area, but found no clue, Varden offered. Did everyone head in the same general direction after I departed? Why would we go any other? You think we want to wander into those humans you have got settled farther out? Varden did not hide his contempt. Malfurion chose to ignore the tone. And Therebrin returned alone. The mage looked impatient. You have asked this before, and I will ask it again if I have to. You would be surprised how an answer can suddenly change. The Archdruid slowly rose, then, after catching his breath, started off in the direction that he recalled most of the Highborn heading. "Do you remember your own path back?" "Of course." "Lead on." With a shrug, Varden obeyed. He pushed through the underbrush, Malfurion right behind him. As they walked, the Archdruid continued to reach out to the flora, speaking to various trees, bushes, and more, but with the same predictable lack of results. This was not a use of his skills for which even Malfurion was prepared. "Are we done here?" asked Varden at last. "I see no reason for you to stay. I would like to survey the area a bit more." "As you like." The Highborn departed without another word. Sighing, Malfurion looked over the territory. In truth, he could think of little else he could do, but he had not wanted to give up in front of the Highborn. He suspected that Varden had not quite shown him the path that the Highborn had followed. But even if Malfurion had known the precise path, it was doubtful that he would have gleaned anything useful from the plant life. The flora had taken notice of the spell work, but had otherwise paid no mind to the creatures involved in it once it had ceased. One of the largest trees shifted its branches. In doing so, it spoke to the Archdruid. Someone was watching him from deeper in the forest. Without even turning, Malfurion set the forest in motion to deal with the spying eyes. The trees in that direction bent down, their branches creating an impenetrable wall around the hidden observer's vicinity. At the same time, the underbrush sprouted, ensuring that it would tangle in his or her footing. Flowers, suddenly blooming, released clouds of pollen. With easy steps, the Archdruid strode toward the area. As he neared, he heard not only futile struggling, but also coughing. The flora gave way to him, creating a passage just wide enough. Malfurion held his staff ready, although in truth he feared little. A figure became visible as the foremost trees straightened and the underbrush shifted. He continued to cough and also sought to rub his eyes clear. The pollen, while seemingly insignificant, had invaded both his lungs and his eyes with effectiveness. Malfurion gestured. A selective wind swirled around the other figure. With the direction that only Malfurion could give it, it not only blew the pollen from the other's gaze, but also provided fresh air that helped lessen the coughing. Through bloodshot eyes, Edric stared at the Night Elf. Archdruid! The human sneezed. Praise be. I thought some monstrous creature had me. Merely a precaution. When others are spying on me, I like to know who they are. Gen's man looked aghast. Spying on you? Hardly that. I was just on a hunt. I flushed out the prey but lost it around here. I thought I heard it in that direction. He pointed where Malfurion had come from. And a moment later, the entire land seemed to fall upon me. Malfurion gestured, and the rest of the barrier vanished. He need not have made any motion, but felt it was good to further remind Edric of just whom he faced, and why it might be wise to speak truthfully. Of course, Malfurion intended no true harm to the human, but keeping Edric off balance might provide the Night Elf with some information. You are far from the encampment, Edric. It must have been quite the hunt to bring you this far. Now, would you like to explain again? The Gilnean looked away. Malfurion could all but read him. Edric feared betraying his lord in even the slightest manner. Your loyalty is commendable, but if you do not tell me now, I must demand the truth from Gen. With the summit imminent, any question I have concerning Gilneas's application to rejoin the Alliance might tilt matters in a direction neither he nor I would prefer. The human swallowed, then finally nodded. It's nothing, Archdruid. I wasn't meaning to watch you at all. It's just that you happen to be here. I happen to be here with one of them. One of the Highborn. You have been watching the Highborn. Swallowing again, Edric continued, My lord knows some of their history from you and others. He distrusts whatever influence they might have. It was something Malfurion had heard before. Those previous to state this belief had all been night elves, though. No slight was meant to you, the human quickly added. My lord has the greatest respect for your abilities and word. Then he may take my word that the Highborn are of no concern to Gilneas. That should keep him from sending you or anyone else on unnecessary excursions. Edric bowed his head. Yes, Archdruid. Malfurion took on a kinder tone. I know that you are all on edge due to the summit. It will go well. We understand. Please give Gen my best. The human gave a short bow, then scurried into the forest. Malfurion frowned and turned toward Darnassus. He believed that Edric had told the truth when he had said that Gen Greymane distrusted the Highborn. The Archdruid also believed that Gilneas had not had anything to do with the One Mage's disappearance. But what Malfurion Stormrage also believed was that this incident somehow was tied to the summit, and possibly the desired failure of it. Chapter 9. A Final Farewell. The funeral for Shalasir was a short, relatively modest affair, despite Tyranda's desire to see Jared's bride honored appropriately. That had been due to Jared's choice. He had felt that Shalasir would have not wanted much pomp and circumstance. She had preferred simplicity, and he believed that included her final rites. Of course, there was also the nagging guilt that perhaps Gerard had insisted on the shorter ceremony, simply so as to lessen his agony a bit. Attendance was limited to those who had known her best. The High Priestess stood behind the funeral bier upon which the body of Shalasir had been placed. The light of Elune shone down through the temple ceiling, focusing on both Gerard's beloved and Tyranda. Darkness covered us in the beginning, she uttered, and we could not see. We cried for guidance, and the moon shone down bright upon us. Her soft light not only illuminated the night for us, but also gave comfort. Her light touched us from within, enabling us to see even when the moon was not visible. Whether this was entirely fact was not something debated among the Night Elves. What the High Priestess stated concerned as much the souls of her people as it did actual events. What no one could argue with was that the Mother Moon took special care with her favored children, and they were grateful to her for that. Gerard knelt at the forefront, his gaze never leaving Shalasir's beautiful, almost ethereal face. She could have been a marble statue, so perfect did she seem to him. His mate looked utterly at peace, even appearing to wear the hint of a smile. Now, Tyranda went on, we ask that the Mother Moon guide our sister Shalasir on her sacred journey, and that her ancestors and loved ones who have gone before her will make her welcome. Gerard heard nothing after that. He saw only his life with Shalasir and all the mistakes that he had made during it. He was grateful that she had put up with him despite all those mistakes when, had she remained behind, she could have been a revered priestess of the Mother Moon. Tyranda raised her arms, reaching toward the moonlight. Gerard broke out of his reverie for a moment, then lost interest again. He looked up a moment later as a silver aura suddenly radiated from Shalasir's body. No one else seemed to notice, or at least no one reacted. Gerard stared at the soft, comforting glow as it rose over his beloved. It took on the vague shape of a figure and slowly separated from the still form. Shalasir, Gerard murmured. The shape paused, and to his mind, looked in his direction for the space of a single breath. Suddenly he recalled other tender moments in his time with his mate, in some cases moments he had not remembered in centuries. Gerard relived each as if it had happened only yesterday. Shalasir's spirit shrank in upon itself, becoming a tiny, glowing ball. It hovered a moment more, then moved, as if drawn by the moonlight. As the sphere swept into the moonlight, it dissipated, and Gerard felt Shalasir's presence vanish at the same time. Gerard let out a gasp, but fortunately no one paid him any mind. At some point Tyrande had lowered her arms, and from her expression it appeared that the ceremony was nearly finished. Indeed, all that remained was for her and Gerard to lead the bier and a procession of mourners out of the temple, through the gardens, and into an area beyond the city. There, a small party of druids, led by Malfurion, greeted them. Tyrande spoke to all. As Shalasir's spirit has departed her mortal vessel, let that vessel now return its strength to the world. The druids took up the body. With reverence, they set it into a soft patch of grass and small bushes. Two female druids lovingly adjusted Shalasir so that she again looked as if she were only dreaming. Teldrassil welcomes this child, Malfurion intoned. The world welcomes this child back. The archdruid raised his staff. A soft wind swept through the area. The treetops gently swayed. Around Shalasir's body, shoots grew, then bloomed into white and golden flowers. At first they simply outlined Gerard's mate, but then their numbers grew so great that they began to drape over her. More and more flowers blossomed, quickly spilling over her. The effect was a beautiful draping of the female night elf, and Gerard could not help thinking how fitting the sight was. Her serene face was the last part to be covered by the foliage. The flowers continued to sprout, rising into a tremendous cornucopia of color. A rich, wondrous scent wafted past Gerard's nose, a scent that reminded him so much of Shalasir. Those who had come now paid their respects to him, then left. Soon there remained only a handful of observers, including Malfurion and Tyrande. This went as well as it could have, the archdruid offered. There will be more and more of these ceremonies, as mortality catches up with us, Gerard returned before Tyrande could say so herself. I am honored that Shalasir was one of the first. It made her departure a little easier to take, I admit. He bowed his head to the High Priestess. I must confess, I was especially touched when you made it seem as if Shalasir's spirit had risen up to join the Mother Moon. Tyrande looked puzzled. I planned no such thing. I would have been very afraid of offending you, Gerard. She gazed deep into his eyes. You saw that happen? Yes, but Elune favors you. I would envy your moment, save that I respect that she made it one between you and Shalasir only. It was not you? No. Gerard's eyes widened, but he quickly recovered. He glanced at the lingering attendees. I was hoping Maiev would come. Tyrande cleared her throat. You should not take it personally. Your sister has been through much. There was a time when she and I could not face one another. The former guard captain frowned. I know of it, High Priestess. She related part of it to me earlier. The rest I was told by some of those who knew my sister and me when we were young, or who were privy to events. But only Malfurion and I, or Maiev herself, could tell you about what truly happened. I know that she was Illidan's jailer, and that at some point she was his prisoner, and that he tortured her. The High Priestess looked sad. I blame myself for so much that happened to Maiev. I should never have left her for so long in charge of Illidan's imprisonment. I should have realized more than you, my love, the Archdruid countered. He was my brother, my twin. To Gerard he explained, when Illidan was liberated, after so many millennia, it was as if her entire life had been for nothing. Her greatest purpose had become keeping him imprisoned. Maiev was all but shattered. Yes, that would be how my sister would react. There was never a greater love for her than her duty. Tyrande took control of the story once more. She was determined to hunt him down. It went from duty to obsession. Unfortunately, circumstances were not so simple. Events happened that led to disaster for all of us. I tried to stop a threat, and nearly lost my life to it. Rather than come to my aid, Maiev chose to pursue Illidan. Just say that she chose to sacrifice you, Malfurion blurted with revived anger. Mal, remember yourself. Tyrande's eyes went from her mate to Gerard. The Archdruid bowed his head to Maev's brother. Forgive me, Gerard. I should not put your sister in such a light, especially at this time. I care only for the truth, however terrible it might be. The truth is, the High Priestess muttered with much sympathy, that she convinced others, including Malfurion, that I was dead, swept away in a raging river, and that his brother was to blame. Nothing mattered but that Illidan be caught and finally made to pay for all his crimes. She nearly succeeded, Gerard learned, but when Malfurion had seen the horror in Illidan's face when he had learned of what had happened to Tyrande, the plan had fallen apart. Through the confession of the mage Kaothas, who would later become the guiding force behind the creation of the magic-addicted Blood Elves, they had then learned of Maev's falsehood. The Archdruid had kept Maiev rooted where she was, while he and Illidan had gone on to rescue Tyrande. Afterward, Malfurion, feeling that he owed his twin for that, had been instrumental in seeing to Illidan's flight and exile into the otherworldly realm called Outland. What felt like a chill wind coursed over Maev's brother, making him briefly shiver. Gerard found it strange that neither the Archdruid nor the High Priestess noticed the cold. Then he realized the chill had actually come from within, from becoming more aware as to how his sister's sense of duty had relentlessly driven her on. I know what happens next. My sister would not give up even then, Gerard remarked dourly. She followed, and the rest of what I learned came to be. The pursuit through Outland, her capture and torture, and finally her part, alongside others, in the slaying of, pardon, Archdruid, of your brother. Malfurion shook his head. You have no reason to apologize. This is all knowledge you should have. If not from us, then from Maiev. For a time, we thought her dead. As we had thought you, Gerard. The High Priestess looked down. Her watchers had all but perished due to her obsession. When Maiev did return, there were bitter feelings and mistrust. Her mind had been ravaged, yet she endured. Her resilience is one reason we were able to make amends, Gerard. There is much to admire about your sister, and much we owe her, despite all that happened. Tyrande put a comforting hand on his arm. It is kind of you to say that. Gerard shifted uncomfortably. If I may, I would like to spend some time here alone. Of course. We must return anyway. More of our guests are arriving. The former commander nodded. May all go well with the summit. We can only hope. The High Priestess and the Archdruid each respectfully bowed to Gerard, then left him by the burial site. He watched them depart, aware that he had not been told everything. However, none of that truly mattered now. All he cared about was this final place of rest for his Shallasir. Gerard knelt by the flowers. Their scent touched his soul and immediately made him think of tender moments with his mate. He imagined her with him. And at last, with the visual evidence of Shallasir laid to rest, and with his mind now forced to think beyond the moment, Gerard Shadowsong looked to the flowers and quietly asked, "So what becomes of me?" Malfurion did not speak until they were far from Gerard, and even then he kept his voice low. "You were not honest. At least, not fully. You did not tell him everything about the conflict between you and Maiev when she reappeared. It was not necessary. Maiev and I understand one another. Her devotion to duty is not something to be taken lightly. She has made amends, and that is the end of it." "I am glad. But then why did you not tell him more?" Tyrande smiled softly. "That right belongs to Maiev." Their attention was caught by a young priestess moving toward them. Her expression was anxious. "High Priestess," she greeted, bowing. "There are more arrivals below. Apparently from a submarine." "A submarine? That means the gnomes have arrived, too." "Almost everyone is here, then," Malfurion said. Tyrande nodded. "There is no sign of any ship from Stormwind." "No, High Priestess." "I see." Tyrande exhaled. "Thank you for the news. We shall go directly to the portal. Have attendants ready for our new guests." "Yes, High Priestess." The other female rushed off to obey. "He will come," the Archdruid offered. "He has to." "That is what Chandris indicated. But if Varian Rin is coming, he is waiting until the very last moment. We cannot very well hold off the summit until we know with all certainty." "No, but there will be little point to it if he does not come. Now, Mal." They did not discuss the point more. Returning to the portal, the Night Elves waited for the gnomes. As the pause lengthened, Malfurion and his mate looked at each other in curiosity, and not a little concern. "Could one of their devices have gone off down there?" the Archdruid finally asked. "Someone likely would have come through to report it." "Assuming anyone could." The portal abruptly shimmered again. With some relief, they watched for the gnomish leader to step through. But what took shape within at first looked like nothing with which the Archdruid at least was familiar. It had two long legs bent back like a bird's, a stout, round carriage, and what seemed two pairs of arms, the upper ones much smaller than the lower duo. For its size and girth, it also appeared to have a relatively tiny head. The figure fully formed, and despite all his concerns, Malfurion could not help chuckling quietly at the newcomer. The bald gnome had the large-nosed, round face of his ilk, and in some manner resembled a short, fat human, although there was no known link between the two races. This particular gnome, despite being elder in status, seemed as animated as a child. He was not so tall. In fact, standing, he was a foot shorter than Kurdrin, and certainly barely a third of the latter's bulk. Malfurion had to make all these assumptions from past visits, for most of the gnome was hidden by what had first appeared to be his body, and was instead some fantastical walking device. The newcomer raised a pair of odd goggles, then peered at the Night Elves with inquisitive eyes. "High Priestess Tyrande Whisperwind, and Archdruid Malfurion Stormrage," the gnome rattled off at a breathtaking rate of speech. "I am pleased to be here." "High Tinker Gelbin Mechatork, you are most welcome," Tyrande declared. Gelbin tugged on his short white beard in thought, then grinned. The machine marched him forward until he was within a yard of his hosts. The huge right arm of the machine suddenly shot toward Malfurion. Although not frightened, the Archdruid chose caution and took a step back. A 3-fingered hand paused within a couple of inches of his chest. "Oh, do excuse me. I've been trying these experimental arm attachments for the newest Mechanostriders. Still fine-tuning the movements. I only meant to have it shake hands." Steeling himself, Malfurion reached to the mechanical hand. The gnome shifted a lever, and the hand gripped the Night Elf's own. Tyrande let out a slight gasp of concern, but Malfurion simply did as the High Tinker suggested, shaking the walker's hand. The moment that was done, the fingers released their hold on the Night Elf, and the arm retracted. With clinical interest, Gelbin Mechatork leaned over and asked, "How was the pressure? Any fractures or breaks?" "No, none at all." "Ah, finally." Gelbin sat back in triumph. Behind the walker, other gnomes stepped through the portal. Unlike their leader, they came in on foot, although all wore objects or gear that clearly were devices of their own manufacture. They peered up at the High Tinker, then at the Night Elves. Tyrande greeted the rest of the party, then said to Gelbin, "We have food and drink prepared, and space set aside for your endeavors." "Wonderful. We've still some equipment to bring up. Will we be near where your sentinels practice their archery? Dwendal here has a new possible weapon that may be able to fire 50 arrows in a minute, if it would just stop doing so in every direction each time." Dwendal, a red-headed gnome clearly much younger than most of his party, looked a bit sheepish. "I have seen to those arrangements as well, High Tinker. If you will follow these sisters." Making some adjustments, Gelbin did as she bade. The walker strode like a large, flightless bird after the priestesses. Gelbin's companions, the huge sacks each carried clanking ominously, tried to keep up as best they could. Watching the gnomes, Tyrande murmured, "That is nearly everyone but Stormwind." "Yes, for the sake of the others, we will not be able to hold off." The High Priestess looked disturbed. "Elune would not have granted me that vision if it did not have significance to the summit. Varian Rin must arrive soon." "We can only..." A terrible uproar erupted from the direction of where the gnomes had gone. Without hesitation, both Night Elves rushed to see what was happening. They found Gelbin and his party confronted by Druken and several of the Dark Iron dwarves. The dwarves had their axes and blades out, and their faces were filled with fury. Gelbin had the arms of his walker extended toward the Dark Iron emissary, but it was clear that the High Tinker was not proposing that Druken shake hands. Behind Gelbin, the rest of the gnomes had drawn a variety of odd-looking but no less sinister devices. Even Gelbin himself had stashed on his mount a weapon the Night Elves recognized as Wrench Caliber, so named in part because it was roughly shaped like the tool. The complex series of cogs, pistons, runes, and levers somehow enabled it to serve as a good mace. The other weapons were not so recognizable to the Archdruid and the High Priestess. Some resembled blunderbusses, while a few made absolutely no sense. However, in the hands of gnomes, they could only be dangerous, even to their wielders. "Your tongue I'll cut out and slice up for meat between me bread," growled Druken, clearly having uttered several threats already. "And that infernal device you sit on will make a good still for strong dwarven spirits." "I am still very much in the early stages of testing the strength components of this mechanism," Gelbin dryly responded. "It would be fascinating to discover just what force would be required for it to divide you in half." Druken's followers muttered, and two started for the gnomes. Druken angrily waved the pair back. "What is the meaning of this?" Malfurion called out in the hopes of quickly distracting the two sides. The Dark Iron seemed no more pleased to see him than they did the gnomes. A fiery-eyed Druken waved his axe at Gelbin. This gnome tried to run me over with his stinking toy." and I said that the incident was purely accidental."
"Cease your babbling."
Druken took a step toward the gnome. Both sides leaned in toward the inevitable struggle. But a brilliant silver glow coming between them startled the two factions. The dwarves and the gnomes pulled back. Tyrande lowered her hands and the glow dissipated. Striding between Druken and Gelben, she calmly said,
"Now, I am certain that this is a misunderstanding." The High Tinker had already admitted that his creation had some corrections that needed to be made, and perhaps should have taken those into account before moving among others. Also, Master Druken may be wary of his surroundings, but he should understand that he was invited here, and that means that his safety is guaranteed by me and my husband, as it is for all honored guests. I only ask in turn that he respect that this guarantee applies to the others as well.
Yes. I suppose I should be a bit more cautious until the controls are fine-tuned, Gelben responded. He frowned, although I am growing dubious about the worth of these arm attachments.
Druken put away his weapon. With a grunt he said, "The fairness of the High Priestess and the Archdruid is known even to us. The journey's been long. I'll leave it at that." To the gnome's escort, Tyrande said, "Sisters, I believe you were leading High Tinker Gelben and his party to their quarters." They took the hint and immediately guided the gnomes on before hostilities could boil over again. At the same time, Druken gave the High Priestess a cursory bow and led his companions off. "And so it begins," the Archdruid muttered. "The pretense that all is well with each member of the Alliance is starting to unravel. Even the Dark Irons should have been able to understand that Gelben meant no harm, and the gnomes should have not become so defensive so quickly. Their nerves were clearly already frayed before their arrival. No one wishes to show weakness, my love, even if in these extraordinary times it would certainly be reasonable to do so. We already knew how terrible things are in some of the other regions. That they have all come here is a sign that, despite everything, the Alliance holds together." Malfurion shook his head. But to what extent? She took his arm and led him off to the temple. "That," the High Priestess answered soothingly, "we will find out come the morrow. Until then, there is little point in worrying too much." Malfurion frowned but said nothing. As he and Tyrande headed off, though, he took one last look at the portal. But the one figure he hoped would materialize did not do so, and the Archdruid wondered if he truly ever would. Chapter 10. The Banquet. With all having arrived, save Stormwind, it behooved Malfurion to indeed see that the summit began. In order to build the mood to a positive level, he and Tyrande had agreed to host a banquet for all the guests. Accustomed to dealing with diurnal races, the Night Elves held the dinner banquet at sunset in an open area just beyond the confines of Darnassus. With food and drink of countless varieties set before them and the tranquil forest nearby, the rulers, emissaries, and their staffs gradually relaxed. Even Druken went out of his way and permitted food not brought by his vessel to be served to the Dark Irons, but only after his chosen taster had verified that nothing was poisoned. Night Elf musicians played not only music composed by their own race, but also favored works from among the peoples represented by the guests. There was only one common thread between the songs. All of them had been chosen to stir the heart, to suggest promise in the future. Yet there were still undertones of trouble brewing. Malfurion had spoken with more than one representative, and in the process sought to verify his suspicions concerning the state of each realm.
What he had learned at times discouraged him far more than his confident face reflected. Among the dwarves, food was growing scarce, and old bitter rivalries threatened to engulf the race. To add to the troubles, many of their underground passages had collapsed during the cataclysm and still needed to be cleared. Thus far matters had not come to a head, but they needed only one incident to have that happen. The human domains also had to rebuild, and some of them were arguing over where current borders existed. Food and shelter were common problems, and Tyrande and Malfurion had already promised what aid the Night Elves could offer. Sisters of Elune and Druids now journeyed through each part of the Alliance, using their abilities to heal both the people and nature. But, from what Malfurion had heard, it was not enough. Still, overall, the banquet began to have the effect that he sought. The dwarves did not even argue among themselves, and the gnomes had not set off any disastrous inventions. Seated by Tyrande, Malfurion looked at the empty places to his right. Gen indicated he would be arriving soon, the High Priestess informed her husband. Edric just came with the message. I thought I saw Edric, but I was not certain. There should be... He hesitated as he caught sight of a shape nearing the banquet. Odd. Who is that approaching now? It looks like a Draenei. Tyrande squinted, something she was having to do more and more often, in the direction he was staring. Not just any Draenei. That is Velen. Others began to notice the extremely tall figure. He stood nearly a foot taller than Malfurion, in the golden robes. His skin was alabaster white, and his legs ended in thick, cloven hooves. The prophet had silver hair that reached past the shoulders and was set in ornate braids. He also had a matching beard that hung nearly to his waist. Velen's eyes were a brilliant blue and literally glowed. But most arresting of all was the luminous sigil just above his head, a sign of the gift he had been granted from the mystical Naru, energy beings from beyond Azeroth, beyond the otherworldly realm of Outland. They were creatures with an affinity to the holy light, of which Velen was now the chief prophet of the Draenei. Other Draenei wielded the power of the gift, but none so much as the figure before the assembly. In fact, the light not only emanated from the sigil, but at certain times almost seemed to faintly surround the august arrival, though it could have also merely been some trick of the eye. Velen himself radiated timelessness, with only wrinkles around his ancient eyes. However, up close, one could see minute cracks in his alabaster skin, as if he were a statue hewed eons ago. Malfurion did not know how old the Draenei was. Older than any night elf alive, that much was true. Even Druken stood as Velen joined the banquet. Almost as one, the guests dipped their heads or bowed in respect. There was something about the Draenei that spoke of an inner peace and knowledge that most could only dream of attaining. Small wonder, since Velen was not only leader of his people, but a priest as well. The Draenei raised the crystalline head of a long purple staff in Malfurion's and Tyrande's direction. Both the large crystal and the smaller one at the bottom of the staff briefly shimmered brighter. Hail to you, Archdruid and High Priestess. Forgive this intrusion. The presence of the prophet is never an intrusion, Tyrande returned as solemnly, speaking to the others as well as their new guest. And Velen himself is ever welcome here as a friend to all. We are all grateful for the aid he and the Draenei gave us during the recent conflict with the demons of the Burning Legion. The priest bowed his head. It is we, the Draenei, who must thank the Alliance for taking us in, and even more so for standing against the foulness of the Burning Legion. Do not think so little of that. Never had there been a world that could stave off the demons not merely once, but more. Tyrande once more acknowledged this for all in attendance, but insisted more personally to the prophet. The
The final victory might not have been ours if not for you and your people, Velen. None here will deny that either. I am honored that you think so, but know that we will always be indebted to Azeroth. Thus, I come to promise you now that the Draenei will do all we can to help the various lands of the Alliance in whatever capacity we may best. There was startled rumbling from the attendees, the Night Elves included. Malfurion leaned forward. Your people are not returning to Outland. We just assumed. Velen smiled as if well aware that he would be faced with this very question. Some have been sent back to revitalize our civilization there, but the rest of us will remain here on Azeroth for so long as we are needed. The High Priestess looked around at the others. I think that I speak for all of us when I say that this is a noble gesture for which we can only express again our own gratitude. Most of the other representatives of the Alliance murmured their agreement. The Dark Irons were the only ones to look not entirely satisfied with this revelation. Velen looked pleased at this overall acceptance. Please join us, revered one, Tyrande added, immediately signaling the servers to add a seat next to Malfurion and her. The two made certain that none of the other representatives would be deprived of space for this unexpected addition. I would be happy to join all my friends here. A little water is all I need. Despite that insistence, Tyrande had some food and wine also brought. Some slight surprise at the announcement aside, the Draenei was a welcome guest. The banquet settled down. The mood lightened. Tyrande exchanged a hopeful look with Malfurion. From their right, just beyond Velen, Kurdran let out a hearty laugh at something the Draenei said, drawing the Night Elves' attention. The prophet looked mildly amused at the effect his words had had on the dwarf. Kurdran turned to tell one of his countrymen something in regard to what he had heard from Velen, and paused to warily eye a party approaching. At the same time, the musicians, evidently also noting the newcomers, paused. Genn Greymane had arrived at last. The king of Gilneas was flanked by 4 of his people, 3 men and 1 woman. Edric was one of the escort, and he at present listened to something that Genn whispered. As before, the Gilneans looked like any other humans, though Genn's escort obviously consisted of seasoned fighters. If not for his confident stride and bearing, Genn might have simply been one more member of the band. He wore little ornamentation marking his regal status. The most evident sign of his rank was the Gilnean crest embossed on his shirt just over the heart, which Genn absently touched as he entered the gathering. The downfall of his kingdom had very much humbled the once haughty monarch. If there was anything to distinguish the Gilneans from most other humans, it was a wariness in their gazes as they neared. It was not a look of distrust, but rather of defiance. Yet defiance not against anyone in particular, but at the world in general. As they reached the center of the banquet, Genn raised his hand shoulder high. The other Gilneans stopped. The king took a 6 steps more, then halted in front of the Night Elves. My apologies. The delay was unavoidable. His eyes fixed on Velen. You must be Prophet Velen. I've heard much of you. I wasn't aware you'd be here. I am Genn Greymane. The prophet bowed his head. Greetings, King of Gilneas. I am also familiar with you. Tyrande and Malfurion rose, the former declaring, Welcome, Genn Greymane. Please take your place with us. Before I do, I must say something to all here. His announcement spurred glances of curiosity and concern among the other leaders and emissaries. Malfurion fought off a frown. Please speak, Genn, the Archdruid finally encouraged. We will be glad to listen. Malfurion's declaration quieted the others, though some, especially the Dark Irons, still watched with wariness and concern. The king nodded. I'll make this short.
I made some terrible decisions years ago. I abandoned the Alliance for what I thought was the right course for my people. That proved to be a sorry mistake. He cleared his throat. What I'm saying is that I thank you all for giving us this second chance. With that, Gen bowed to the other guests, then led his party where they were to be seated. Rather than prolong what had clearly been an awkward moment for the human, Tyrande immediately signaled for the musicians to begin anew. She also made certain that the Gilneans were quickly fed and that the other guests had more drink and food brought to them. The meal progressed. Personal conversations began to develop and a serious note crept into some aspects of the scene. Kurdrin had shifted over to Turvosh to speak about something that caused the Archmage to frown but nod. Across from them, Druken watched with narrowed eyes, then returned to his food. A moment later, though, he rose and, to their surprise, went to speak privately with the High Tinker. Do you think these conversations are a sign of hope or fragmentation? Malfurion quietly asked his mate, his serene face belying his concern. Each of their lands is trying to recover, as even we are. They are no doubt attempting to see what they might be able to gain from others. In a sense, that might bring them together, but only if they do not feel that they have to sacrifice too much in turn. Which means that you think these conversations are both. Tyrande touched his hand. Yes, my love. Unfortunately, I do. She smiled slightly. But at least they are talking, and that is something to work on. He noticed her look past him. What is it? There are 2 sentinels seeking our attention. The Archdruid casually turned in that direction. Seeking their attention was an understatement. Clearly, only the fact that so many officials from the Alliance were gathered here prevented the pair from racing toward its leaders. The 2 had purposely kept where the vast majority of the banquet could not see them. Both gripped their weapons, frequently looking over their shoulders at something behind them. Stormwind, perhaps, he asked. The High Priestess rose. If so, from their stances, it cannot be good news. He surveyed their guests, then muttered, I am coming with you. She made no move to stop him. Velen looked up at her as she stepped away, nodding as if to show that if they needed his support, whatever the matter, he would give it. Some of the other guests watched as they departed, but the Night Elves pretended not to notice. Moving with measured steps, they finally reached the 2 sentinels. And there they discovered that behind the pair stood at least half a dozen more, along with a very dour Maiev. Tyrande wasted no time. Speak. But it was Maiev, not the lead sentinel, who spoke. Stepping forward, she answered, High Priestess, there is a body. The Archdruid looked grim. Show us. Tyrande gave orders to one of her senior priestesses to take care of the guests. That problem dealt with, she and Malfurion followed the others from the vicinity of the banquet. Maiev and the sentinels headed directly for the temple. My decision, the Watcher informed them. I thought it best. You did right, the High Priestess acknowledged. In one of the lesser-used inner chambers, they at last came across 2 sentinels guarding a Night Elf-sized form covered in cloth. Who? Tyrande finally asked, unwilling to wait even long enough for the makeshift shroud to be drawn away. Maiev removed her helmet and tucked it under her arm. Gerard's sister stared directly at Malfurion. A highborn. The one, I am told, you were informed went missing. One of the sentinels uncovered the face. As Maiev had said, it was a highborn. Malfurion knew immediately which one, too. Therebrin, the Archdruid rasped. Where was he discovered? Not all that far from where I and the other Watchers practice, Maiev responded with a scowl. Tyrande looked grave. He did not die by accident, did he? Maiev reached down and pulled the cloth further. The savage gaps just under the highborn's chin greeted the shocked duo. Only if he decided to slit his own throat twice. The second for pleasure, I assume. She straightened, and made sure that a missive we found with him remained pinned to his body when he fell. She spoke in a clinical tone, as if describing the general shape and appearance of a stone rather than the murder of one of their own. It did not at all surprise either Malfurion or Tyrande to hear her speak so. Maiev was ever precise, ever to the point, when performing her duties. "What did this note say?" the Archdruid demanded, a new chill running through him. Maiev was prepared. She handed him a ragged piece of parchment stained in great part with the unfortunate Therebrin's blood. On it had been scrawled in what also appeared to be the mage's bodily fluids, a message written in a long disused style of Night Elf script that stirred memories of the days when Zinashari was still the capital and the evil of Queen Ajara was as yet unknown. Suffer not, traitors. "We knew that there would be those who would never forgive them," Tyrande said. "But we thought that they would listen to reason, at least up to the point of not going through with such a heinous act." The Archdruid returned his gaze to Maiev. "Found near where you practice?" "Yes. Either someone thought him a gift, or they decided that the Watchers could be blamed." Her declaration was not without merit. Maiev and her Watchers were among the many uncomfortable with the thought of the Highborn's eventual return to the fold. "This will not remain a secret," Tyrande said, "and should not." Malfurion agreed. "More important, we must find the assassins and deal with them before this grows worse. The timing can be no coincidence. This is not just about the Highborn. This is meant to cause chaos during the summit." "You are right, my love. I will ask Chandris." Suddenly kneeling before Tyrande, Maiev bent her head and declared, "Let me uncover the culprits. I know the facts better than any. I have investigated the body for all clues and studied the area in which it was found. There is nothing more anyone else could do. Give this matter to me. I swear I will do all in my power to see that those who would seek to foment unrest among our kind will be dealt with." Tyrande looked to Malfurion, who nodded. The High Priestess gently put a hand on Maiev's shoulder. The kneeling Night Elf looked up, gaze intent. "I can think of few more dedicated to our people and their needs. Take command of this investigation, Maiev, and do it with my blessing." Some of the sentinels did not look entirely pleased with this choice, but held their peace. Maiev looked as if Tyrande had granted her the greatest desire of her life. She rose and saluted the pair. "I will see this through, whatever sacrifice it must take." "I insist you take care, Maiev." Gerard's sister grudgingly nodded, but her eyes did not show agreement. Both Tyrande and Malfurion were aware how focused Maiev could be when set upon a mission. In this case, they needed that focus, and thus neither said more to discourage the Warden from following through, as she might need. "The Highborn will want Therebrin's body returned," Malfurion commented. "I think it best if I lead that effort. They already believe that the rest of us would rather see them wiped from the face of Azeroth. This will hardly improve their disposition." "Do as you say." The High Priestess touched his cheek. "But take care around them." "You know that I will." Maiev bowed her head again. "With your permission, I will begin this hunt immediately." Tyrande nodded. Replacing her helmet, Maiev silently departed. "I will send 4 sentinels with you when you go to the Highborn," Tyrande informed her husband. "They will act as bearers for the body. Let me seek the aid of some of my calling. It might not be wise for the Highborn to be confronted by armed fighters just now."
She saw the wisdom in his choice. "Are you going to leave immediately?" "Not just yet. I wish Velen's opinion on this and some other matters. I had not expected his arrival, but it may be that it was fortuitous. We will need his steady demeanor to keep temperatures from boiling over once all know of the murder. Every distrust among the various factions will suddenly rise to the forefront." It was decided that the Sentinels would remain on guard here for as long as needed. Tyrande also summoned another pair of priestesses versed in the preserving arts to do what they could to maintain the freshness of the body. Aware that they could not let the Highborn wait long before being told of the discovery, the Archdruid and the High Priestess quickly returned to the banquet. They had feared that their absence might have caused a wariness to settle over the other participants, but to their relief, everyone still seemed at ease. Part of that likely had to do with Velen, who had departed his seat to speak with the Dark Irons. What matter there was that would bring the Draenei and the dwarves together, neither Night Elf could say, but Velen had somehow managed not only to keep Druken distracted, but also to make him feel cheered. "The light truly works in amazing ways," Malfurion murmured to his wife. "And Velen is clearly schooled in the art of diplomacy." Tyrande hesitated as she saw another sentinel approaching. "More news." The sentinel saluted and immediately said, "High Priestess, Stormwind has arrived." The news brought both relief and concern to Malfurion and his mate. Tyrande asked, "How long ago?" "When I left with this news, they had just disembarked. I searched for you here but could not find you." The High Priestess eyed her husband. "The attendants on duty at the portal have orders to guide the party to their quarters, but I should go and greet Varian." To their other side, Gen Greymane's voice suddenly rose above the din. He had an audience that consisted of most of Kurdran's party. Gen, clearly much more relaxed due to not only the acceptance the others had shown, but also the dwarven ale he had just finished downing, had begun regaling the others with some of his past battles against the Horde. "The key was to keep our front united," the king was saying as Malfurion and Tyrande moved on toward Velen. "Split us apart and we'd all be crow food. Each man knew that to falter would mean his comrades dying for his mistake, and none would have that. We let out the Gilnean battle cry, consisting of a pleading for mercy so great the orcs no doubt turned from the lot of you in disgust," said a mocking voice. The effect of the words on Gen Greymane was immediate. He leapt up from the table, in his fury sweeping aside the food and drink before him without care to where or upon whom it landed. A dark cast fell upon his features, and for a moment he seemed to swell and even begin to change. "Who dares spout such a monstrous slur upon me and Gilneas? Who?" His outraged gaze swiftly pored over each and every person seated there, seeking the culprit. Most simply stared back, as stunned as he at the savage pronouncement. A few looked about anxiously, and a few, such as Malfurion and Tyrande, looked from Gen Greymane to the direction from where the speaker actually stood. Malfurion took a step toward the commanding figure, but the High Priestess stayed him with a hand. The King of Gilneas caught their movement. He followed their eyes to his accuser. "You! And having swayed the orcs so eloquently, you no doubt did as all brave Gilneans do so well, skulked away and hid until the battle was over." Gen clearly desired to lunge for his counterpart's throat. His hands grasped at the air as if already crushing in the windpipe. Yet somehow he managed to stay his ground and simply growl. For his reaction, he received nothing but a look of contempt from the newcomer, who then, with a much more polite manner, turned to the banquet's hosts and bowed. "High Priestess Tyrande, Archdruid Malfurion, it's a pleasure to see you again," Varian Rin calmly remarked.
Chapter 11. Darkened Hearts.
Need to get closer.
Never have I nor any of my warriors acted so basely, Genn declared, visibly struggling with himself. The bravery of Gilneas. Bravery? Varian Wrynn cut in.
Need to get closer.
Tall, commanding, his features handsome in a brooding manner, the King of Stormwind was to his own people already a hero out of legend. He had, in point of fact, lived a remarkable and dangerous life that had not only for years separated him from those he most loved, but also left him for a time bereft of his memory. His trials made for rousing tales that bards could sing before swooning ladies. And his 2 long scars, one running across his cheeks and the bridge of his nose, and the other descending down the left side of his face from the forehead to the cheek, both legacies of the several times he had barely escaped death, only added more flavor to those stories. Stories for which Varian himself had no taste whatsoever.
I'm out of brains.
The definition must be different in Gilneas from what it is in most other lands. The very opposite, I'd say. The insinuation that Genn and his people were utter cowards proved too much for the elder monarch. His expression darkened. Some of those in his retinue growled low and seemed ready to move toward Varian, but Genn staved off their advance with a sharp glance. Malfurion moved to intervene. King Varian, we had no news of you and your retinue arriving below. I preferred it that way, the former gladiator answered, acting now as if Genn did not even exist. Varian shoved aside an unruly lock of dark brown hair. The eyes of a hunter surveyed each and every person in sight, Varian Wrynn ever instinctively marking those around him by their potential threat. The archdruid purposely stood between the pair. And your son, is Anduin with you? Naturally. Varian said it with such an absolute tone that Malfurion felt slightly foolish for asking, though many monarchs would have left their only heirs in the supposed safety of home rather than bringing them on any sort of journey. The king briefly tilted his head back. The night elf looked beyond Varian to where 4 members of the king's personal guard flanked a slightly shorter figure dressed in the regal blue and gold of Stormwind. Prince Anduin, his own blonde hair cut short, bowed his head to the archdruid. He wore a high-collared shirt covered by mail that was in turn draped by the golden lion head crest of his kingdom. The prince was not armed, save for a dagger at his belt, but with so many guards in Stormwind's party, his safety would have been ensured in almost any place, much less Darnassus. In contrast to his father, who was every bit the fighter, Anduin was a studious youth. Moreover, there was an aura of selflessness that reminded Malfurion of only one other person present. Without thinking, Malfurion glanced over his shoulder at Velen. To his surprise, the prophet's eyes registered the same intense interest in the human boy. Velen sensed exactly what Malfurion did, perhaps more. Genn was taking long, deep breaths that were designed to bring his temper back under control. Varian looked unimpressed by the other king's efforts. The archdruid continued to try to defuse the tension between them. King Varian, forgive us for not being there to greet you. You, your son, and your companions are welcome to join the banquet immediately if you wish. Your seats await you, and food and drink will be shortly coming. I'm not inclined to stay here, the monarch of Stormwind bluntly replied. I sailed to Darnassus for the sake of the Alliance, not him. He indicated Genn. If it's all the same to you, Archdruid, the journey was a tiring one, so I think I'll retire already. Genn moved toward his counterpart again. In a lower tone he said, Varian, let us talk. I did what I thought was best for my people. You must understand that. I never realized the full folly of my arrogance when I chose to build the wall and what it would mean, cutting off Gilneas from the outside. Varian's gaze never left the archdruid. He said nothing to Genn. This only stirred the king of Gilneas to further effort. I swear an oath that we will be as brothers to all other members of the Alliance, that we will give aid in whatever manner needed. Gilneas will not shirk its duty. There will be no more loyal member, especially to its fellow human realm, Stormwind. Stormwind wants no such brother at its back, Varian burst out. Varian, Malfurion murmured. The younger king's body shook from fury. He lowered his gaze, staring bitterly at Gen from under his brow. I didn't ask to wear the mantle of responsibility, to become the bearer of humanity's standard. It was enough to rule Stormwind and protect my son. But I did it because I had no choice. Who else was there? Not Gilneas. Stormwind, with Theramore at its side, has had to face the dangers, and now you want to come in under our wing and pretend you'll stand with us this time? We will stand. You needn't worry yourself, Greymane. Stormwind and I have done without you, without Gilneas, and certainly without the Worgen, and we'll continue to do so. What you truly desire is redemption for your traitorous crimes, which you'll not get from me. Gilneas was a sovereign nation. We seceded during a time of peace, not war, and for good reasons. You know that. As for the coming vote... However, Varian turned his back on the other human. Excuse me, Archdruid and High Priestess. I will see you later. Before Malfurion could even respond, Varian whirled back the way he had come and stalked off. In his wake followed his retinue. Malfurion looked at Tyrande, who had already signaled a pair of priestesses to hurry after King Varian. As she focused in Malfurion's direction, her eyes widened. A low, animalistic snarl escaped from where Gen stood. The Archdruid immediately returned his attention to the human. Gen bared his teeth in a feral grin that stretched far beyond where human limits should have allowed. His body swelled, and then, again, the human regained control of himself. Forgive me, Archdruid, the sweating figure muttered. I should have known better. I should have. I suggest you return to your seat and... No, I can't. Gen gestured to Edric and the other Gilneans. With Gen in their lead, the party silently departed for the forest. The other guests murmured among themselves. Tyrande indicated for the musicians to play again, but it was clear that the banquet would soon be winding down. The confrontation had eradicated the hopeful mood of the participants, a situation that Malfurion would have to work hard to correct. However, as he turned to discuss this with his mate, he noticed that one member of Stormwind's party had not left. Anduin, who was at this moment quietly speaking with Felin. As the Night Elves approached the pair, they heard the Draenei saying, "And what you know of the light is indeed true, but that is only the slightest of its many facets, young Anduin. To fully appreciate the wonder of the light, you must look at it from the perspective that best lets you see its full place in the universe, and how it may become part of our very being. Such requires patience and learning." I can do that. But what I want... Prince Anduin. Two of the king's personal guard had returned. Their flushed faces and hurried movements bespoke of the intense reprimand their monarch had no doubt given them upon discovering that his son was not with the party. The two burly soldiers barged past the Night Elves and came at their prince from opposing sides. The one who had called to the prince, a hardened veteran with a nose that looked as if it had been broken more than once in battle, reached for Anduin, who did not hide his frustration as he rose to face the guards. "Prince Anduin, your father was most upset when he discovered that you'd neglected to follow us. The king has commanded that you come immediately." Anduin looked as if he were ready to snap something at the unfortunate guards, who all knew were only doing their duty and likely feared being punished, but held back. With a resigned nod, the prince joined his two keepers. He briefly turned to face the Night Elves and the others, bowing to each group. Only then did he silently gesture to the two anxious men to lead him to his father. "Young Anduin has a quiet strength," Velen commented once the boy was gone. "A pity his father seeks to cage him, as he does himself." "Varian nearly lost him more than once," the Archdruid remarked. "His fear that Anduin might vanish or be taken is not unfounded." Malfurion frowned deeply. "Nor are his harsh words to Gen Greymane, I am sorry to say." "Gen will make amends for all," Tyrande interjected. "You know that as well as I. We already know how much he sacrificed to get matters to this point." "But will it be worth it in the end? They nearly attacked one another. Gen came very close to losing control of himself, and with some reason." "Perhaps we should discuss this at another time," the High Priestess commented. "Velen, if you could—" But to the surprise of both Night Elves, the Prophet had surreptitiously departed the conversation, almost as if he knew the two were about to enter into subjects best discussed purely between them. "Well, we can trust Velen, that is for certain," Malfurion murmured. Then, sobering, he added, "Tyrande, before you speak, I have to tell you. He is the one, Mal. I know Elune tells you so, and I understand that it should be so. But you saw him. Varian could perhaps be the leader the Alliance needs, yet he also stands a very good chance of becoming the one who further guides it to disaster." "Varian is troubled, I agree. More than troubled, though with good cause." The Archdruid tugged on his beard in contemplation. "And his disdain for Gen strikes me as being as much for himself as it is for the King of Gilneas. There was that in his tone that hinted more of self-reproach." "I heard that also." The High Priestess casually glanced to her side. "The others are beginning to leave. The banquet is over." The banquet was a debacle. The others here have seen Varian proclaim the Worgen unfit to be part of the Alliance. We cannot let that notion stand. "I will go speak with the others. Perhaps you can do something with Varian." "Perhaps." Malfurion could not hide his doubt concerning such a hope. She put her hand on his. "Elune will guide us. Have faith." He grunted. "I, of all people, should I not? Go. Speak with Varian." Malfurion knew better than to argue when she used that tone. They kissed. Then the Archdruid, with a bow to the remaining guests, followed after the King of Stormwind. To someone who had slept in bug-infested cages and grimy, blood-soaked cells during his days as a slave and gladiator, the woodland quarters offered by his hosts seemed far too soft in comparison. Even Varian's chambers back home were not nearly so calm, so peaceful. The king considered departing Darnassus for the relative familiarity of his confining quarters aboard ship, but respected his hosts enough not to insult them. Or at least not insult them any more than he had with his denunciation of Gen Greymane. Varian had no regrets there. In fact, he had a rather great satisfaction. He knew that he had behaved badly, but in Greymane he had found an outlet for some of the fire ever raging within him. There was a knock at the door. The Night Elves had gone out of their way to make their guests feel at home, and so the chambers set aside for Varian and his retinue were fairly human in design and accommodations. Unfortunately, they still had that nature feel he always associated with those of the Archdruid's race. Far better were the oppressive stone walls of the keep. One of the guards cautiously opened the door. Even in Darnassus one did not take chances. Varian had already caught wind of something amiss, something that had happened just before his arrival. Anduin and the two bodyguards sent to retrieve him entered. Varian, his heart lightening, went straight to his son. "You had me worried." To the two men he growled, "Let this not happen again. Should any harm come to my son, I will have—"
Leave it be, Father.
Anduin spoke quietly, ever calmly, but still he did momentarily what no one else could. Silence the king. Recovering, Varian said,
Anduin, you must understand.
You are the Prince of Stormwind. Nowhere, not even here, should be considered safe enough for you to go wandering off. You always need at least a guard with you.
Yes, I'm not very good at defending myself, the prince retorted.
I'm not the great warrior you are. You and Magni have already seen how badly I handle a sword, even in practice.
I didn't mean...
The prince sighed. It was a sound Varian heard often, and usually because of something he had done out of concern for his son.
No, you don't.
You never do, Father.
I'm back, safe and sound, as usual.
Anduin. Against any foe, the king could stand resolute in his next move. Against his son, he constantly floundered.
Good night, Father.
The prince walked on, following his guards to the room set aside for him. As unsettling as the conversation no doubt had been to their guards, Anduin had actually kept it from getting worse by cutting it off. Varian knew that, could even appreciate it, but that still did not ease the sting of his son's obvious reprimand. Now the serenity of the night elven dwelling finally proved too much for him. Stay here, he commanded the guards, aware as much as they that he was placing them in a similar position as when Anduin had not remained with the party. I need to walk. They knew better than to argue. No longer paying them any heed, Varian strode out. However, like in his quarters, the tranquility of the capital did nothing to ease his heart. Instead, he stared at the forest beyond. His pace quickened. The wilderness beckoned. King Varian, I was just coming to see you. The human hid his disappointment, though for a moment his eyes lingered longingly on the trees beyond the city. Archdruid, he responded, finally acknowledging his host. My thanks for our quarters. They will do just fine. Which is why you had to flee them at the first chance, the night elf returned with a slight smile. Please, I will not stand on ceremony with you. Call me Malfurion.
Then I'll ask you to call me Varian.
As you wish. If you do not mind, I hoped to have a word with you. The Lord of Stormwind exhaled.
My sincerest apologies for ruining your banquet.
The banquet is of no consequence. The gathering is. You appreciate bluntness, Varian. I am more concerned about your confrontation with Gen. The mere mention of Greymane's name stirred the embers within. Varian's pulse pounded. I'd prefer not to speak about that, Malfurion. The night elf would not be dissuaded. Varian, I must ask you to consider everything that happens before, during, and after the summit in light of what Azeroth has become due to the cataclysm. Each choice we make has to be carefully weighed.
You're referring to the induction?
Of course. I hope you will see reason. The king no longer had any desire to head to the forest.
Is there nowhere I can be free?
Malfurion was clearly intent on pressing forward with his point. Varian could see only one way to at least end the conversation. I'll give Gen and the Worgen a fair consideration. You have my word. Malfurion heard the finality in his voice, and wisely accepted the answer as it was. Thank you, Varian. That is all I can ask. Another figure intruded upon them. Varian fought down his impatience with the seemingly never-ending situation. His trained eyes took in the newcomer, who, though a night elf, was dressed in a colorful outfit that the king thought Malfurion surely also found gaudy. Archdruid Stormrage, the other greeted solemnly. Varden. Varian's sharp ears caught a slight inflection in the night elf's voice, as if the Archdruid not only knew what this other figure wanted, but dreaded it for some reason. Exactly what the other elf was finally registered with Varian. He recalled the reports. So this is a highborn. The highborn barely seemed to notice the human. The king recalled the apparent arrogance of Varden's kind. He also remembered that they were magi, and reckless ones at that. The archdruid said, "I thank you for your time and your reply, Varian. I look forward to speaking with you further." The king took advantage of the situation. "Naturally. Forgive me now. I must be going. Good evening." He did not even acknowledge the highborn as he left, thinking that the other elf did not deserve any better than he gave. Varian gratefully departed the pair, silently wishing he had never sailed from Stormwind. A slight movement in the trees nearby caught the corner of his eye. Varian did not focus on it, aware that by the time he turned, the source would be gone from sight. Besides, the king was fairly certain just what had been lurking at the forest's edge. His scowl deepened. Under his breath, he muttered, "Damned Worgen." Varden did not speak until the human was long gone. Malfurion, aware of the news he had not yet had the opportunity to present to the highborn, solemnly waited. The archdruid wanted to hear Varden out to see how much the latter knew. "I am here concerning the disappearance," Varden bluntly stated. "You know that." Malfurion waited for the highborn to continue, but that apparently was all the mage wished to say for the moment. Instead, Varden looked expectantly at the archdruid. There is no use delaying the inevitable, Malfurion thought. So, Maiev Shadowsong has informed the highborn of everything already. He got no further. Varden's perplexed expression told him that the mage had no idea whatsoever about anything concerning Maiev, or her discovery. What should we know about Archdruid? Therebrin is dead. Murdered. Varden stiffened. Tell me. Malfurion did, leaving out no detail. The spellcaster remained stone-faced throughout. The only true sign of his growing fury was his hands, which folded into tight fists and stayed so. The body will be returned to us immediately, Varden declared when Malfurion finished. His voice held no emotion. He stared past the other night elf as if seeing something far, far away. There will be no further desecration of it by anyone for any reason. That was the intention. Maiev. Yes, the warden. She can continue with her investigation, but she will not speak with us. If there is anything we learn, we will relate it to you, Archdruid. I leave it to you to let her know what she needs. It was hardly the most logical system, but the Highborn were not very trusting, and at the moment, Malfurion could not entirely blame them. I will speak to her as soon as I can, he promised Varden. The mage did not answer, his gaze once again distant. The edge of his mouth twitched. Malfurion grew disturbed. Varden, I swear that Therebrin's death will be investigated thoroughly, and the assassins brought to justice. I only ask that the Highborn have some patience. We cannot afford patience, Archdruid, Varden blurted. He finally looked directly at Malfurion again, and in those eyes the Archdruid read a sense of dread. You see, I did not come to speak with you about Therebrin. Another of my people has gone missing. Chapter 12. The Horde Strikes. There was still no word from Darnassus, although Haldrissa hoped for it soon. Nevertheless, she went on with her own plans to organize against this latest Horde incursion. Of necessity, that meant a swift, simple ceremony for poor Xanon. The commander said appropriate words for her dead officer, then turned over the final moments to Caridin, one of the 2 druids assigned to her here in Ashenvale, as part of some project of the High Priestess and the Archdruids to bring the Night Elf race closer together. The other, Parsis, was somewhere in the forest behind them, wandering the Emerald Dream or something. Haldrissa was not quite sure. She was as devoted to the ways of her people as most Night Elves, but the Druids were a lot that sometimes baffled and frustrated her. They often seemed to be half asleep, or more even, and spoke about aspects of the world that had no practical use for a soldier. As soon as the funeral finished, Haldrissa headed back. Danae followed close. Although her second obeyed every order she gave without question, Haldrissa could sense a distance growing between them. She was certain that Danae and some of the other officers blamed their commander for not only Xanin's death, but the other losses as well. Of course, most of her officers had not been out in the field as long as Haldrissa, so for the moment she forgave their naivete. If they survived life half as long as she had, they would learn. But will they get that opportunity? She suddenly asked herself. This latest intrusion by the Horde looked to be on a far greater scale than in the past.
We need to get closer.
Danae. Yes, Commander. I want 4 scouts to take their hippogriffs toward the northeast. Not so far as we journeyed. From the air they should be able to see enough even then. Yes, Commander. Oh, and how soon will the full-mounted contingent be ready? We can ride first thing tomorrow. Although Danae tried to maintain a steadiness in her voice, a hint of anticipation crept into it. Haldrissa made certain that her own voice remained calm and in command. If the scouts return with their report by then, we shall. We do not move until then. With your permission, then, I will go get the scouts. Haldrissa's nod was all Danae needed. She rushed off, obviously determined to see to it that the sentinels did indeed ride off the next day. I remember being so eager once, the senior officer thought, then immediately cursed herself for such maudlin notions. The only difference between Danae and her was that Haldrissa had the millennia of experience to know how to temper eagerness with caution. A commander's trait. A low rumble stirred her. From the west trundled in a short train of supply wagons, guided by an armed sentinel escort. The captain in charge of the escort anxiously peered around. Not a good sign at all. Haldrissa immediately headed to her. The captain saluted. Commander Haldrissa. Yes. Did something happen? She surveyed the wagons, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing, that is, save that the last wagon had an extra burden draped out of the back. A large winged form. The stench of decay, so familiar to the veteran officer, was strong even before Haldrissa reached the wagon. We found the hippogriff about a day out, the captain reported as she dismounted. Been dead for some time. Wordlessly, Haldrissa rushed to the huge corpse. She wanted to deny it for what and who it was, but as she neared, the distinctive markings verified the worst. It was definitely Windstorm. And that meant only the worst where Aradria and the message for Darnassus were concerned.
See you around.
He had many wounds, mostly from arrows, but a great axe is what finally did him in, the captain concluded. Haldrissa peered into the wagon. Windstorm's corpse was set against a number of barrels. Of Aradria Cloudflyer there was no sign. The courier. Where is she? We found only the hippogriff, not her, though there were traces of blood elsewhere that could have been from the courier. We did discover several dead orcs. Never mind the orcs. What of the courier? Cowed by Haldrissa's fury, the young officer blurted, As I said, she was nowhere to be found, but... Nowhere to be found. The commander took heart from that. She saw the scene playing out. Windstorm, sorely wounded in the sky, had no doubt brought his rider to the ground so that she could escape on foot with the pouch, while he sacrificed himself to keep the orc scouts at bay. That the orcs had penetrated so very deep bothered her, but Aradria's escape made up for that. There were places en route where an expert courier such as Aradria could gain another mount. The captain had been saying something, but Haldrissa had not been paying attention. What was that? I said that we also found this there. Haldrissa herself could not see it, but her expression must have been terrible to see, for the captain suddenly gaped at her. The tattered pouches gave testament to the folly of the commander's earlier hopes. Aradria had not gotten away. She would have never abandoned the missive. Either the orcs had disposed of her body or some beast had dragged it away. And Darnassus still had no idea what was happening in Ashenvale. Danae. Abandoning the confused captain, Haldrissa hurried after her second. Danae already had scouts preparing for the mission. However, rather than sending them ahead as originally planned, this time she would have all of them wait until she had had 4 more copies of the previous message written. Then the scouts would head to Darnassus. Danae would just have to bridle her eagerness to hunt down the orcs for another day or so. Matters could wait that long at least, so Haldrissa believed. Danae! She shouted. Her second stood with the 4 scouts, evidently just about to send them off. Danae! Her voice did not carry enough. Eager to march off herself, the younger officer signaled permission for the 4 scouts and their hippogriffs to depart. The group quickly rose into the air. Danae finally turned in response to Haldrissa's shouting. Commander? Signal them to return. Aradria never made it. I want all 4 of them to head to Darnassus instead. She had considered using owls to carry the messages. However, not only were the hippogriffs much faster, but the riders could also defend the missives. The other sentinel rushed to one of the signal horns set aside for summoning the warriors to action. It was their only hope of recalling the hippogriff riders in time. Danae put the curved horn to her mouth and blew as hard as she could. The blare caused every sentinel to pause in what she or he was doing. Too late, Haldrissa realized that many of them, already preparing for the deadly march, might think the call to action had come sooner than expected. But if the horn stirred the post for the wrong reasons, at least she saw that it served its other purpose. The lead scout glanced over her shoulder, saw Danae gesturing, and had the party turn about. Praise alone. Haldrissa moved forward to meet the descending hippogriffs. She had a few instructions to pass on to the scouts before hurrying to write out the new messages to Darnassus. A cry above made her stumble. Near her, Danae let loose with an oath. One of the scouts dropped limply from her mount, plunging to the ground as the other night elves stared in horror. The fletchings of 2 arrows thrust up over her back as she landed. Haldrissa had fought too many battles not to recognize the horde markings. The sky was suddenly filled with arrows. At first, the commander thought that the archers had miscalculated the distance, for the bolts flew too high to properly descend upon the sentinels below. Only when one of the other scouts and her mount were struck several times did Haldrissa see the terrible logic. It was not the encampment that was the immediate target. It was the scouts. The horde was already prepared for her plan. As the arrows brought down the second scout, other shouts arose ahead. Haldrissa saw several warriors pointing to the east. Smoke rose from 2 other locations. She did not have to guess its origins. 2 of the outposts lay in those directions. Sentinels, form ranks! Danae cried out. Prepare for imminent attack! As sentinels, including blue-armored huntresses with shields and glaives, raced to obey, Haldrissa stirred in frustration. Those were orders she should have given. She eyed the forest beyond, wondering how the horde had gotten so near in such numbers. They had clearly made several forays into the area to have such an excellent understanding of their surroundings. But she also knew the terrain well. Danae! 20 to the southeast edge of the post. They will have to come from there. I want a mounted force of huntresses with shields and lances readied. With the horde presence in Ashenvale having grown over the past months, General Chandris had decided to include lancers, a seldom utilized aspect of the Night Elf armies since the end of the War of the Ancients, in the Sentinels' arsenal of weapons. "Get the other!" A hippogriff's squawk cut her off. Another of the winged creatures dropped. Her rider, a shaft through her arm, managed to jump off before the creature hit. The last of the scouts managed to land. However, even the ground proved no sanctuary. More arrows flew, these designed to target those within the encampment and, Haldrissa saw, especially the area where the hippogriffs were kept. Worse, the landing scouts had given the archers a fairly good notion of just where that was. Someone among the attackers had planned very, very well. "Get the hippogriffs to cover!" Haldrissa ordered. She drew her glaive. There was still no sign of the invaders themselves, but that would surely change in moments. Haldrissa had to use what little time remained to her advantage. Her gaze fell upon Caridin, who ran from wounded fighter to wounded fighter, using his druidic powers to heal them as best he could. The commander chose to leave Caridin to his own devices for the moment, as additional concerns occurred to her. "Archers, form ranks!" She saw that some had already begun to, but as a whole they were not moving as quickly as Haldrissa would have hoped. "Northeast, east, southeast, 20 paces from the gate." Of necessity, the main post was surrounded by high wooden walls. When it was being built, the trees sacrificed had been honored as if they were fellow warriors. Haldrissa now prayed that the trees had retained their great prowess even in death. She suspected that the sentinels would need it. Guards on the wall crouched low as they surveyed the forest beyond. Thus far they had given no sign of sighting the enemy, although a few moved about as if momentarily believing that they had. The deadly whistle of another rain of arrows filled Haldrissa's ears. Danae shouted a warning to the gathering huntresses to quickly raise the shields. Arrows clattered against the shields. Unfortunately, some of the huntresses did not move fast enough. Screams rose as at least 3 of them fell with shafts sticking in them, and others struggled with wounds. Haldrissa looked for her own archers and was grateful to see them ready to return fire. Arrows knocked. The archers awaited the word. The commander gave it to them without hesitation. Now the whistling became a sign of hope as night elven arrows soared out over the wall. Haldrissa raced toward it, aware that she would not be there in time to see the bolts descend, but hopeful that there would be evidence of their success. She heard cries from without as she climbed. More than a few. The orcs might have good archers among them, but they were not sentinels. Haldrissa was certain that her people would inflict far more damage. She only hoped that it would be enough. As if in answer to her question, another stream of arrows returned just as the commander reached the top. Although she managed to duck, the sentinel nearest to her was too slow with the shield she carried. The thick arrow completely piercing her throat, the dead night elf toppled back off the wall. Haldrissa peered into the forest. For the first time, the horde began stepping from the protection of the trees. They were spread throughout the edge of the forest in various positions, and while a few had bows, others seemed intent on merely watching. No, not watching. Counting. Counting the return fire and the number of sentinels on the walls. Squatting down again, Haldrissa turned back to those farther inside. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Below, Danae looked as if her superior had gone mad. She hesitated long enough for another rush of arrows to answer those from the horde. Haldrissa silently cursed as the bolts flew over her. The orcs were expert warriors. By now they could make a good estimate on the sentinels' strength in terms of the archers. Sure enough, as she looked outside again, she saw the orcs at the edge begin to creep back. Simultaneously, the forest quieted. No new flight assailed the night elves. "They have retreated," one younger sentinel naively murmured to a comrade. "They are gone." No, the commander replied, startling the pair and others nearby who, in the excitement, had forgotten that she was there. No, they have only moved back a little for a short time. We remain under attack. The first person to forget that will likely not have to worry about punishment from me. The Horde will have already killed her. The warriors grew solemn, and several tightened their grips on their weapons. That was how Haldrissa wanted it. If they remained ready for the worst, they had a far better chance of survival. She quickly descended to Danae. "How are the archers?" "A few wounded, 3 dead. Say the word and we will send another greeting to those vermin." "Never mind that. The hippogriffs. Were they able to get most of them to cover?" 4 are uninjured. 2 more are wounded but able to fly. 2 others have injured wings and cannot be counted. Another is sorely wounded, and I fear he will die. 6 viable hippogriffs. It was better than Haldrissa had hoped, although fewer than she would have liked. We do not have much time. See if Caridin can do anything for the less injured ones first, Haldrissa ordered. She paused as a dark look passed over Danae's face. "What is it?" "I meant to tell you next. The druid is dead. In the last flight of arrows, a good number fell his direction. He was focused on our wounded and failed to protect himself sufficiently. I believe he died quickly, pierced so many times." Haldrissa cursed. They saw a chance to take out the druid. "Where is Parsis?" "No sign. He may be dead already." The commander could not waste more time on the subject. The Sentinels had survived without druidic assistance for millennia and would do so now. "We move on, then. Get every archer ready quickly. The Horde will not wait long before beginning their attack in earnest. We do not know how many of the outposts have been hit and how many of those have been overrun already. We need to get word to Darnassus, but this time I want sufficient cover for the hippogriffs and their riders." "Do they each carry a copy of the message?" "Damn the message! At this point, all they have to tell General Chandris is that Ashenvale is under full assault. Now go get them ready." Danae rushed off with a swiftness that the veteran warrior suddenly envied. Haldrissa already felt as if she had fought an entire battle, not merely the opening skirmish. The archers reassembled, though initially they kept in a loose enough arrangement that if the orcs fired at where they had initially stood, there would be few casualties. It bothered Haldrissa to even think of success being measured by trying to have losses kept to a minimum. But that was war. The more of her fighters she saved, the better, even if it meant some others might have to sacrifice themselves, including her. The hippogriffs were ready just a few minutes later. In all that time, the orcs had not fired one shot, nor even sounded one horn. Haldrissa worried about that. Whoever was in charge of the attack had something insidious in mind, she was certain. Danae signaled her. Haldrissa silently motioned for the archers to ready themselves. When they had their bows nocked and aimed, she nodded to the brave scouts and hippogriffs, then to her second. Danae waved off the party. The great winged creatures flew into the air, their riders bent low. Each animal took a slightly different direction, but all headed toward the west. "Fire!" Haldrissa commanded. The front ranks of the archers let loose. The second held back, though, just as she had ordered. The stream of arrows soared out toward the forest. As that happened, the hippogriffs beat their wings harder. They rose higher and higher. Again, Haldrissa gave the order to fire. The latter ranks shot. All the while, those who had first fired readied their bows once more. There was no return fire yet. Haldrissa almost held her breath, waiting for the Horde to try to shoot down the hippogriffs. Yet they did nothing. At last, the winged creatures and their riders were out of bow range. The commander finally breathed a sigh of relief. "Look there!" someone cried. Haldrissa looked for the long-awaited flight of Horde arrows, but instead a more stunning view awaited her. High above and closing fast from the east were nearly a dozen blurry specks that coalesced just enough to reveal reptilian forms with bat-like wings. Red reptilian forms. Red dragons, Haldrissa at first gasped, before recognizing that these were more bestial in appearance, and more primitive of form. No! Red proto-dragons! She had only heard of them in Northrend, but there had been rumors that the Horde had attempted to bring them to other regions. Savage creatures with stouter, toothy muzzles, they raced along the sky with clear intent. Their wings had sharp points to them, and the proto-dragons roared with monstrous eagerness as they closed. Too late. Haldrissa realized that she had played exactly into the Horde's hands. With an attack already underway, they had expected her to try to send another warning to Darnassus. Haldrissa had just sent the riders and their mounts to their doom. The Horde could not have many proto-dragons. These were likely most, if not all. However, these were all they needed. Almost double the number of hippogriffs, the proto-dragons broke off in pairs to pursue the as yet unsuspecting riders. A horn blared, Danae seeking to warn the scouts. Yet even though some clearly reacted, it was too late. The proto-dragons and their orc riders had been waiting in hiding so near that it did not take them much time to overtake their quarry. Hippogriffs were hardly defenseless, and those working with the sentinels were especially adept at battle. Unable to gain enough distance on their pursuers, most of the hippogriffs turned to face the proto-dragons. The scouts readied their bows. One fortunate scout got off a shot that swiftly dealt with the orc astride one proto-dragon. The dead warrior tumbled off the side of his mount and dropped like a rock toward Ashenvale. Two proto-dragons caught a hippogriff between them. The hippogriff slashed with his talons, raking the snout of the nearest proto-dragon. The orc rider tried to aim his own bow, but the wound made his shot go wide. The hippogriff's rider fired back with success equal to the previous scout, sending another horde corpse falling to the ground. Unfortunately, in focusing on the one proto-dragon, the hippogriff by necessity had to pay little attention to the other. The scout tried to knock another arrow in order to deal with the second, but in the process left herself open to the axe of that proto-dragon's rider. The orc struck hard, the axe blade crushing through armor, flesh, and bone. With a cry, the scout clutched the bleeding stump of an arm. The night elf was put out of her misery by a second swing of the blade, leaving the hippogriff to fend for himself while still bearing the dead rider. The brave creature managed another good swipe, this time at the underbelly of the second proto-dragon. The beast let out a pained roar and tilted to the side. The orc tried to cling on, but with one hand still gripping the axe, he could not. What saved him was the first proto-dragon, which appeared as if by silent command under the dropping orc. Grabbing hold, the orc repositioned himself on his new mount. Both the badly injured proto-dragon and its comrade closed on the hippogriff. Fangs tore into a wing. Claws ripped at a neck. The hippogriff made one last lunge at the most wounded of his adversaries. He tore into the throat of the proto-dragon. The proto-dragon planted its nails on one of the hippogriff's wings. So entangled, both plummeted to their doom. In an attempt to see their mission to fruition, two of the hippogriffs attempted to flee west. One did not make it far, and although the scout tried to aid by firing at their pursuers, a proto-dragon managed to cut the creature off. Unlike in the previous struggle, the hippogriff and night elf were unable to put up much of a defense before both were ripped to shreds by the combination of teeth, nails, and axes. The full aerial combat quickly began to shrink as the trapped defenders fell one after another. Two more proto-dragons perished, as did their orcs, but soon there were only the one scout and hippogriff still seeking to outrace the two mounted proto-dragons, slowly but surely closing. The trap had been set well, and Haldrissa felt personally responsible for each death she witnessed. Worse, there was nothing she could do but watch as the last was trapped. The scout and his hippogriff fought as valiantly as their comrades, even bringing down one of the other proto-dragons and its rider, but in the end they too fell. The entire struggle had taken place over perhaps 4 minutes, though to Haldrissa it had seemed a horrific eternity. The sentinels had not simply stood by as this all happened. Lancers astride night-sabers readied to lead the charge out the gates. Sentinels on foot held their glaives steady. Archers held off their fire, now awaiting the word that the horde was finally attacking in earnest. The guards on the walls cautiously peered through carved gaps, waiting for the first rush of orcs. But nothing happened. Chapter 13. Gerard's Hunt. Although Velen's arrival had not been expected, there was no question as to his staying as an honored guest, just like the rest of those representing the Alliance. However, the Prophet was not one who desired much in the way of accommodations, and insisted on a simple chamber. Tyrande saw that he received one that still faced him toward the temple proper. The tranquility of the temple gardens appealed to Velen, and so the present moment found him meditating there. The Draenei sat with legs crossed, facing the center of the gardens, his concentration on the light. The 2 honor guards the High Priestess had assigned to him he had requested to stay behind at his quarters, their presence surely not needed in this of all places. He suddenly sensed the presence of someone else approaching him, someone who also had a tremendous affinity for the light. It could be only one person. Without looking, Velen quietly said, "Welcome, Anduin Wrynn." The human did not seem at all surprised that Velen sensed him, a further sign that the light was very strong with King Varian's son. "Hello, Prophet. I'm sorry if I disturb you. Please, the title is one given to me by others. I prefer simply Velen." The Draenei smoothly rose. "Your father does not know you are here." "No. He thinks I'm asleep." Anduin could not hide his guilt. "It is not for me to judge whether you should have stayed in your quarters or not. That is for you to decide." This statement seemed to put Anduin at ease a bit. "I'm old enough to make my own choices, despite what my father thinks. I love him, but he fears so much to lose me again, or to lose me forever as he did Mother, that he nearly smothers me. I can never be out of his sight for more than a few minutes." One can understand his concern, and your difficulty with it as well. Velen, you know why I've come here. You wish to speak more of the light. I am happy to tell you what I know, if you respect that I will not seek to guide you from your father." Anduin nodded, at that moment looking to Velen much like the king. "I wouldn't ask it. I only want to learn more." He put a hand to his heart. "I feel the light here. I feel it more every day. It's as much a part of me as anything else is." "Yes, it is extremely strong where you are concerned." Velen glanced around the gardens, but there was no one else about. "We can talk for a time, if you like, so long as you promise me you will return to your quarters afterward." The gratitude with which the youth radiated was almost as strong as the light within. "I promise." As they walked, Velen studied the boy closely. "Yes, I must teach him all I know, if that is possible. This one has a destiny with the light." Velen ever remained aware of just who walked with him. Anduin was heir to Stormwind, and the Draenei knew how important Stormwind was to this troubled world just now. The Alliance needed Stormwind, perhaps more than even its king realized. Anything that threatened the stability of Stormwind threatened the long-term stability of the Alliance, especially in the face of a resurgent horde. Yet, if the Light had other plans for Anduin Wrynn... "You must move on," Gerard heard his wife's voice murmur to him. It was not the first time since coming here that he had heard it, and while some might have thought that they were going mad, Gerard accepted it as her simply still watching out for him, as she always had in life. He had already departed his quarters some time ago in the hopes of trying to regain some focus. Even though he would continue to mourn Shalazir, perhaps for the rest of his life, he knew that she would have expected him to do more than that. As much as Gerard hated the thought, Shalazir would have wanted him to fit himself back into Night Elf society, find some other purpose. Yet what that purpose might be, he did not know, and in truth did not completely care. Still, Gerard knew that he had to try. There was no question about returning to the military. In part, that had to do with dealing with Chandris, something he was not prepared to do for the time being, if ever. However, it also had to do with Gerard's lingering feelings concerning how he saw Night Elf society. There were hints that things had changed, that Malfurion and Tyrande had begun bringing the various segments of their people closer again. But he needed to see more. The war had left too much of a mark on him. "I apparently am beginning to grow old." Gerard hoped that he would not become as he had seen some of the elder Night Elves he had witnessed just after the war's end. Their entire world turned upside down by the struggle against the Burning Legion and the destruction of Zinashari. They had been unable to cope with their new, unpredictable future. Several had slipped into fantasy worlds of their own that consisted of safe memories of the past. Many of those had never found their way back to reality. But for Shalazir's sake alone, Gerard was determined to live. Forcing himself to leave his quarters and start walking among his own kind were the first steps. He had even made it a point to keep an eye out for anyone he remembered, and be sure to greet them. That had caused a few startled expressions, but Gerard had felt that his wife would have been proud of his initial effort. Still, he was more than happy to finally head back. In fact, the closer he got, the more he picked up his pace, eager to return to what had become his sanctuary. And thus it was that Gerard nearly fell atop the body in his path. He saved himself from doing so at the last minute by grabbing hold of one of the last trees within reach. Even still, the former guard captain dropped down on one knee upon the arm of the corpse. The years since the war melted away as Gerard reacted like a soldier once again. Pressing against the tree, he peered around for the assassin. Seeing no one, Gerard cautiously bent low to investigate the grisly find. At first he wondered if perhaps he was losing himself in old memories. He had not seen such a figure since the war. That Gerard had not even noticed the brightly colored garment bespoke just how deep he had been in his reverie. A highborn. Belatedly it returned to him that they had come seeking readmittance to Night Elf society. With the exception of his accidental leaning on the arm, Gerard was careful not to touch the body. It was already evident what had likely proven the spellcaster's end. The two jagged slits in his throat indicated a large dagger wielded by an enthusiastic hand. There was also something pinned by a rock to the dead mage's chest. Questions filled Gerard's head, some of them very disturbing. One that particularly vexed him from the start was why the Highborn should be here in the first place. What business had the spellcaster had so near where Gerard lived? The answer came to him as he studied the ground nearby. Someone had been careful to remove any footsteps, and he knew why. The Highborn had been slain elsewhere, and then dragged to this spot. Despite the efforts to cover that fact up, there were still some tiny telltale spots of what could only be blood. They led toward the east for a few paces before ceasing. From all this, Gerard decided that the reason that the Highborn had been found by him was simply that the assassins had not wanted the victim to be discovered near the place of his demise. Something there would have possibly given searchers a clue to the truth. It occurred to him suddenly that this was not his task. By rights, he had to report this to the Sentinels, or, more to his preference, the Archdruid or High Priestess. Gerard looked around again, saw no one, and decided to risk leaving the body alone while he searched for someone with authority. Being a druid, Malfurion was likely somewhere beyond Darnassus, so Gerard headed toward the temple. At the very least, he believed Tyrande would be there, and if it turned out the Archdruid also was, so much the better. Gerard? He stopped at the sound of Chandris's voice. Flanked by 4 sentinels, she too headed toward the temple. General, he responded, trying to regain his composure. After her initial outburst of his name, she too sought to bring things to a more detached level. Gerard, you have business with the High Priestess. It took but a moment's debate before he admitted the truth. Yes. Someone has been murdered. Her guards immediately tensed. Chandris signaled them to calm down, though her eyes burned at the revelation. Where? Who? I found the body near my quarters. He gave her a more precise location. It was one of the Highborn. I do not know him. There was some note under him, but I did not touch it. A Highborn? Chandris looked at the guard nearest her left. Send word to Maya of Shadowsong. She hesitated a moment as she noted Gerard's reaction to his sister's name. With the details you just heard. To the guard next to that one, she continued, Take Ildiri and hurry to where he said the body was located. Keep guard over it until Maiev or her people arrive. The other sentinels rushed to obey, leaving Chandris with just the one guard. The general bade Gerard join her, the other sentinel following them. The guards did not hesitate to let Chandris pass. She strode unerringly through the temple to where they found Tyrande. The High Priestess greeted them with a knowing expression. There has been a death. Chandris went down on one knee, the other sentinel and Gerard doing the same. Another Highborn. Tyrande bade them to rise. You found the body, Gerard? He realized that she had read the fact in his urgent manner. Yes, not far from my quarters. I judged that the body had been moved from elsewhere after the murder. I assume to hide facts about the true location. That seems logical to me, Chandris added. I have sent someone to inform Maiev, and others to guard the body until she or the Highborn do something with it. And we shall do something. Not only now with Husrim's body, but also with these curs who think the Highborn will stand by and be slain without repercussion. Malfurion and a Highborn had entered the chamber from another direction. Gerard understood that this was someone high among the Magi, though he doubted it was the leader. That was verified by Tyrande's reply. Do you speak in the name of Archmage Mordant now, Varden? I presage his words, High Priestess. Patient though he is, the Archmage will not let this stand. This lack of progress has been discussed among the Highborn. We would hate to have to make these crimes more public, especially with the emissaries now present for your summit, but we will do so if necessary. Perhaps then something will be done about the murders. He glared at all in the room, finally fixing his blazing eyes upon Gerard. You are the one who claims to have found the body, are you not? I am curious how you happened to be near. I do not claim to have found it. I did. A rare fury stirred in the former guard captain. And if you are considering me as the possible assassin, you will find yourself sorely mistaken. Malfurion raised his staff between the pair. I am certain that Varden is not making any unwarranted accusations, Gerard. We are all struggling to come to grips with this foul matter. I am sure Varden joins me in commending you for immediately alerting us to this second murder. The mage hesitated, then replied, Yes, of course. Thank you, Gerard Shadowsong. It surprised Gerard that Varden knew who he was, especially considering his threatening posture a moment before. He nodded to the mage, but said nothing. All is being done to find the perpetrators, Varden, the High Priestess assured. Maiev is dedicated to the truth, and nothing will stand in her way. She has a coarse way about her, but I have spoken with this one's sister and find her, as you say, the Highborn admitted. However, she is one, where these assassins could be many. Darnassus is surely riddled with those plotting against the return of the Highborn, and we will not stand idly by any longer. At that point, Varden gave Tyrande and Malfurion a fleeting bow, then turned on his heel and marched off. Gerard could not tell whether he had been satisfied by the High Priestess's promises, or he merely knew that he could do nothing without this Archmage Mordant's permission. Amazing that anyone should dislike the Highborn, Chandris remarked under her breath. They are the epitome of respect and congeniality. Gerard made no response, although he was aware that she had spoken so that he was the only other one who would hear. Both Malfurion and Tyrande turned their attention to him. Gerard suddenly felt uneasy. He was certain that the pair desired something of him. Gerard, I want to again express our appreciation of your handling of the vile discovery, Tyrande said. I did, as should be done. Not everyone would have behaved the same way. Your training and common sense shone through. She glanced at her husband, who nodded back. Varden is correct in one thing. Maiev will need some assistance. We cannot afford for this to continue, not only for the Highborn's sake, but also for everything we are trying to accomplish with this summit. My sister is very competent and very determined. I cannot think of anyone more suited for the task. Tyrande smiled. Perhaps. But her brother would certainly be an asset to the search. Even though he had seen the suggestion coming, Gerard did not know how to answer. If the High Priestess, if you think this a necessary duty, it is a request, Gerard, no command. You can refuse and we will understand perfectly. He knew that she truly meant that, but hearing her say so proved the impetus to his decision. I will do my part, though I will bow to Maiev's authority on this. Of course. Tyrande looked grateful. The Archdruid also showed his pleasure. Your support will be invaluable, Gerard. We need everyone right now. I will do all I can. And the first thing I need to do is find my sister and explain this. The High Priestess shook her head. I will inform her. With all due respect, I would like to tell her myself. It would be more appropriate in this case. As you wish, then. Gerard bowed to both. Chandris did the same and joined him as he departed. The general sent the sentinel accompanying them on to other duties. I am very glad to have you a part of this, she said quietly once the pair was alone. Your sister is very dedicated, but often her focus is a bit too narrow. I know Maiev has faults, but I have as many, if not more. We will do all we can to stop these assassinations.
Let us hope so. I am no admirer of the Highborn, but I can see how they might grow restive as their members are cut down. Darnassus, the Night Elf race in general, can ill afford a conflict between them and everyone else. He stopped. You have dealt with my sister. Where would I most likely find her at this point? Where I left the body. Chandris took the unspoken farewell without a beat. She pointed. No, by this point, she and her watchers are probably moving it for better study. I would say your best bet is to meet her there instead. And where is that? The place where she and her watchers train. I know that she organized and conducted her investigation of the first murder from there. Thank you. He dared not say anything more, though her eyes showed that she waited for him to do so. Steeling himself, Gerard bowed to her and headed in the direction she had indicated. As he journeyed, Gerard drew the dagger sheathed at his side. He probably did not need it, but then two people had been slain. That they had been highborn did not rule out that the perpetrators might not kill someone interfering with their plans. The sounds of Darnassus muted abruptly as he neared the location Chandris had suggested. The dark mood of his surroundings fit well with how he saw his sister. She had always been the driven one, while he had simply stumbled through life, rising, in his estimation, more by chance than by ability. Still, Gerard hoped that Maiev would see his value in this mission. The practice area used by his sister and her followers appeared empty. The crudely drawn expressions on the row of wooden practice dummies seemed to mock his failure to find Maiev. False swords raised high and chipped shields ever at the ready, even as savagely hacked as they were, they looked at the moment far more capable than Gerard felt. The male night elf looked around, pondering where to go next if Maiev did not show up soon. He considered the fact that she might have gone to the Highborn encampment, but ruled that out as reckless, even by his sister's standards. Frustrated at not finding Maiev here, Gerard turned and stared directly into the eyes of what could only be one of his sister's watchers. She wore armor akin to Maiev's, but of a slightly duller shade. Her helmet hung from a branch just to her left, as if the watcher had just taken it off. Propped against the trunk of the same tree was her umbra crescent. "You are he," the younger night elf stated without preamble. "You are her brother." She eyed him critically. "I expected you to be taller and more scarred from all those battles." Her comment made him wonder just what Maiev had said about him over the millennia. Had he so disappointed her that she had been forced to make him more in the image of what he should have been? When Gerard did not respond, the watcher added, "I am Neva." She started walking, her movements as smooth as those of a nightsaber. Gerard felt as if she were sizing up prey. Neva circled him, taking in every aspect of Maiev's brother. "No, you are as you should be. Like her." Not certain how to take that, he asked, "Where is Maiev? I need to speak with her." "She was here not long ago." But no sooner did they bring the body of that spellcaster than some of his kind showed up to take it away. Maiev was not too pleased. She was not done with it. Neva might as well have been talking about a chair or some other insignificant object. Gerard sighed. "So she is at their encampment?" "Very possibly." Neva sauntered to his side, then leaned uncomfortably close. "You can wait here with me. She will be back very soon. I am certain." Gerard suddenly pushed past Neva, but not because of her. Rather, something watched both from beyond the area. Something that did not remind him of a night elf. He heard Neva speak, but her words were lost as he threw himself after the spying figure.
Whoever it was moved swiftly and surely between the trees. He remembered what had been mentioned about the Worgen, whom he had yet to meet. This would not be the first time they had lurked around the area during troubling times. Gerard tore through the forest, moving automatically. He was certain that he was on the path the figure had gone. All he had to do was keep to the right behind the next tree. His body was racked by agonizing pain, and he felt as if 100 bolts of lightning had struck him simultaneously. Gerard shrieked and felt no disgrace in doing so. No one could suffer such torture and not react as he did. He tumbled forward, or tried. Falling to the ground in some ways would have seemed at least a little relief. Gerard had the great desire to curl up in a ball and pray that the continuous shock would cease, but some force prevented him. It was as if a web held him in place to ensure that his suffering continued unabated. Gerard tried to tear his arms free. If it had allowed him to escape, he would have at that moment gladly given up those arms. Anything to escape. The hope for death began to stir within him, but then Shalasir's face appeared in his thoughts. She had always enjoyed life, even under the most primitive of circumstances. Gerard, who had never been able to forget the horrors of the War of the Ancients, had learned from her. She had drawn him back to the world in a way nothing else could. And he knew that she wanted him to live, wanted him to go on, not follow her unless there was no other alternative. Feeling her love again gave Gerard new strength. The torture continued, but now he had something upon which to cling. With Shalasir, there had always been hope. The unremitting shock ceased. Gerard crumpled to the grassy earth at last. He welcomed the collision with the soft soil, the rattling of his bones far less painful than what he had been through. The cool surface felt good against his skin. A hand gripped his left arm. The touch was initially enough to resurrect some traces of the monstrous pain. Gerard cringed, fearing the full force of it would return. But although the fingers held tight, the pain receded again, becoming nothing but memory.
"Can you understand me?"
asked an unfamiliar male voice.
"Can you?"
The former guard captain managed a croaking sound that the other apparently took as an affirmative. The figure moved Gerard to the side, finally resting him against a tree.
"I'm sorry,"
his rescuer whispered.
"I didn't know that would happen. I didn't realize that it was there."
Gerard managed another croak. His vision was still clouded by tears. His companion could have been invisible for all he was able to make out of him. He felt the hands stiffen as an unidentifiable sound in the distance reached them. Gerard's rescuer suddenly released him. The night elf did not hear the other depart, but felt certain somehow that such was the case. Gerard's breathing returned to near normal. His vision remained teary, but shapes began to coalesce. Vaguely, Gerard finally registered that he had been caught in some insidious trap. So close to where Maiev and her watchers met, he thought it was possible that it had been set by the assassins to catch one of them. After all, his sister was in charge of the investigation. Barely a minute had passed when light footsteps alerted him to someone's approach. Gerard did not think it his rescuer, and when he heard the intake of breath, a sign of the newcomer's apparent astonishment at discovering him, he knew it to be female. The former captain could only assume it was Neva, who had finally managed to follow his trail. "You live," he heard the watcher say. "Of course he does," responded another, stronger female voice that made Gerard look up. He saw a vague shape standing over him. "He is my brother, after all."